item. I think, as we can see from the audience, that everyone here recognizes that the Colorado River is essential to the livelihood and sustainability of the state. As the agency within the state that is situated and authorized to establish water policy on behalf of the state and its water users, the CWCB recognizes and takes very seriously the leadership role it must provide as we figure out how to plan for the potential of extended drought on the Colorado River. To this end, the board has directed staff, and staff has consistently carried out the efforts to inform the public on the status of the drought contingency planning and in the Colorado River Basin, drought contingency planning in the Colorado River Basin, and to discuss the concept and the concerns that may be associated with exploring demand management in the Colorado River and the upper Colorado River Basin. Myself, and from what I've heard from the board applauds the CWCB staff's consistent and tireless efforts to bring and inform the public items for all the water and reflect the issues and concerns of all the water users. We will continue to do this and provide this input, and we will continue to work in the same manner as we look towards the future. And that is how I wanted to open up this agenda item.
All right, thank you, Director Mitchell. We have Brent Newman with us, and Karen Kwan, and so you two have worked tirelessly on this, so we appreciate your work on this. And so Brent wants to kick it off with some explanation and a few slides too. So if everybody out in the audience can see that one, this one over here is kind of hard to see, but hopefully you can see what Brent is going to show. Right on. Thank you, Brent.
Thank you, Director Jan. Brent Newman, CWCB staff for the record, and I'll be joined on today's presentation by Karen Kwan from the Colorado Office of the Attorney General. And we're going to introduce agenda item 13 today, Colorado River Basin Drought Contingency Planning. So I'll be kicking off today's discussion. First, we'd like to update the board on some recent CWCB outreach on the topic of drought contingency planning in the Colorado River Basin and what we've been doing for pretty much over the past year to get the word about this effort out around the state. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the element of demand management as contemplated in the Upper Basin DCP. And then Karen is going to go over some of the interstate efforts, working with the 7 basin states and the federal government to accomplish this big task. And then, as Director Jan indicated, we're going to hear from some of our friends and stakeholders from around the state on the matter of demand management. First of all, just a little bit of history. The board directed staff in late 2017, early 2018 to begin this comprehensive outreach effort to stakeholders, water users, and water managers around Colorado. This outreach effort is intended to allow staff and board to identify and evaluate these possible options for avoiding any sort of involuntary compact curtailment situation, consistent with our water plan goal identified in Chapter 9.1, that the state will support strategies to maximize the use of compact water while actively avoiding a Colorado River compact deficit. This effort is serving 2 key purposes. One is to work with our stakeholders and partners around the state to examine demand management efforts as they're being assessed within Colorado. This helps us inform progress on the interstate and intrastate fronts. The second purpose of this outreach is to serve as a resource for Colorado water users and stakeholders. We want to make sure that our stakeholders are kept in the loop as conversations evolve throughout the Colorado River Basin on DCP or any other initiatives which may affect Colorado water users. To that end, we've been traveling to speak to different stakeholder forums and groups since January. Since then, this is just sort of a brief list of some of the forums that we provided information to about the Colorado River Compact, the other elements of the law of the river, the current challenges related to hydrology, and these ongoing DCP efforts for the 7 basin states and within Colorado. We've made it to just about all of the roundtables, the Front Range and West Slope caucuses, and a series of Conservancy and Conservation District Board meetings, Colorado Water Congress's summer conference, and other water policy forums. These meetings have been well attended, and our conversations and questions received from our stakeholders have been fantastic. Our stakeholders already have a high level of awareness and knowledge about the challenges in the Colorado River, and it's been a good exercise all around for us to engage in these discussions and to hear directly from our water users the challenges and opportunities that they identify in these ongoing efforts. This is a map we threw together just to demonstrate sort of our effort to engage all parts of the state that will be implicated by any issues on Colorado River management, which is obviously all four corners of Colorado. For a lot of the folks in the audience and members of the board, the next couple slides are going to be pretty boring because we've been giving this presentation since January, so you guys have seen it a couple of times. But just a couple of refresher slides for the board and for our audience. Demand management is considered the third line of defense of the Upper Basin drought contingency planning effort. You have these ongoing augmentation efforts, weather modification, phreatophyte management. Then you have the drought operations of Colorado River Storage Project reservoirs, which would move water from the reservoirs that are higher up in the basin to protect these critical elevations at Lake Powell. As far as demand management goes, this element of the Upper Basin DCP is intended to assess the feasibility of demand management as a tool to avoid involuntary curtailment of Colorado River uses. And this is a point that we've been sharing with our stakeholders and making in every presentation that we've given. The Upper Basin DCP does not establish a demand management program. The Upper Basin DCP assesses the feasibility of such a program and explores mechanisms to incentivize this assessment, including potential storage options for water generated under such a program. The Upper Basin DCP looks at these storage options, but any demand management program would have to be set up working cooperatively with our stakeholders and partners within Colorado in concert with our interstate partners. Before any demand management program could be developed, an entire array of legal, technical, economic, and operational challenges would have to be addressed. These efforts are currently being assessed under a scheme contemplated by a resolution of the Upper Colorado River Commission adopted in 2014, temporary, voluntary, and compensated reduction in diversions to conserve water that is otherwise consumptively used. Oh, far too fast. The result here would be water stored in Lake Powell or other Colorado River Storage Project units, specifically geared to ensure compact compliance that would not have been stored but for the conservation activity of these water users. This element would act as the third line of defense for critical elevations at Powell, if necessary after the augmentation efforts and the drought operations of crisp reservoirs. This resolution in 2014 by the Upper Colorado River Commission to examine demand management feasibility raised a lot of questions, and our Colorado water users have begun to identify the challenges and opportunities that such a program could present. This is a brief list of some of the ongoing efforts within Colorado to examine the risk associated with compact compliance and the impacts of curtailment avoided strategies. The Compact Compliance Study is an ongoing effort by the Water Conservation Board and the Attorney General's Office, providing an assessment of options for the state engineer in the case of an involuntary curtailment of Colorado River uses. The Colorado Water Bank Working Group is a cooperative effort of water users and stakeholders studying the impacts of a potential water banking scenario in Colorado communities. The System Conservation Pilot Program will be concluding soon. This is a pilot program administered by the Upper Colorado River Commission. Several projects were completed and are underway in Colorado. And the UCRC recently released a report on this program available on their website, which identified some of the challenges and opportunities this program fleshed out on the Western Slope and throughout the Upper Basin. The West Slope Basin Roundtables are working with the two large West Slope conservation districts on risk studies, which seek to provide a baseline of information for interested parties regarding how these risk management efforts may impact local communities. Ann Castle and some colleagues at the University of Colorado have recently authored a shepherding white paper, which addresses some of the obstacles to moving conserved water downstream. A workshop was held with a lot of stakeholders from around the state to discuss this paper and the conclusions presented. And finally, we have the water plan goal mentioned earlier, which indicates that the state should take an active role in these sort of strategies. It has been important and will continue to be important for the state to consider the input and interactions between all of these ongoing efforts and how they may inform a state position on curtailment avoidance strategies, both with our interstate partners and within Colorado. As we've engaged with our stakeholders around the state, we've begun to see a lot of concerns and opportunities as identified by our partners. We will continue to work as a state team and with our stakeholders to start answering some of these questions that we have identified internally and with the input of Colorado water users. How would such a program work within Colorado water law and the prior appropriation system? What are the impacts of a potential program to a participant? How do you preserve the valuable water rights of potential participants? What are the impacts to the local economies of participation in such a program or to the environment? And how does one accurately and confidently monitor and verify water conservation activities? And then a concern that we've heard among these listed on the screen from stakeholders, the Colorado River touches all corners of Colorado, and how do we make sure the benefits and burdens of such a program are shared equally statewide? Over the past couple of days, we've experienced an uptick in calls, emails, text messages from our partners around the state. These communications all have similar concerns related to the board memo provided to the board on this topic. As a preliminary point, I have to say that I'm delighted other people are reading our board memos. I'm not going to say I thought it was just you guys, but I'm really happy to see this one making the rounds. These are intended to be resources for the board and for the public, and we're glad to see on matters that have such potential impacts to the entire state, people are staying informed and utilizing this resource. That said, we'd like to take the opportunity today to speak on the record and address some of the concerns we've heard related to Board Memo 13 to ensure unequivocally that there are no misunderstandings. As in the previous slide, the memo was intended to summarize for the board and for our stakeholders the entire spectrum of discussions, conversations, concerns, and opportunities that any sort of demand management program may present for Colorado's water users, as identified by the water users, our roundtable members, members of the public, and bright minds on Colorado River issues. This list of considerations, as identified in the memo, does not indicate endorsement or staff recommendation to the board on any of this full range in the spectrum of conversation. We didn't present this sort of list to the board before because we've been having these meetings with the roundtables around the state with the Conservancy and Conservation District boards to identify these concerns. And as the memo indicated, we just want to make sure that the board and the members of the public are aware that conversations on demand management and its potential implementation in Colorado are diverse, complicated, and far-ranging in their conceptual implementation and operation. I made the point earlier that being aware of the full spectrum of options and considerations does not imply endorsement. In any sort of contingency planning scenario, drought or otherwise, the point is to be prepared for the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario on drought contingency planning could be that the 7 states fail to set up such a program. The worst case could also be that we do succeed in setting up such a program, that we work with our stakeholders to set up an operational demand management program, and that it is still not enough water to protect the critical elevations at Lake Powell. That said, all of our state efforts with our interstate partners, with our Colorado stakeholders, and in every outreach presentation that we've given so far, our efforts have been and will be geared to assessing the feasibility of a temporary, voluntary, and compensated program to conserve consumptive uses. I've got this in bold. I'm going to try to say it in bold as well. CWCB and Attorney General staff are not assessing, pursuing, or recommending to the board any type of involuntary or anticipatory curtailment scenario. Furthermore, part of the board recommendation today is the board considering the adoption of a position on the evaluation, exploration, and development of how any demand management program in Colorado would succeed. Staff will recommend to the board that if something other than a voluntary, temporary, compensated effort is needed to assure compact compliance, that the board will work with Kevin Ryan's office and the state engineer to conduct public meetings and outreach to develop and adopt appropriate methods and mechanisms as informed by interstate parties with interest in the Colorado River. You look at this board and you look at the staff that are working on these issues, and when we're talking about demand management within Colorado, this is demand management brought to you by the same people who brought you Colorado's water plan and conceptual framework. We believe in public engagement, transparency, and collaborative approaches to identifying solutions. Moving forward, we're going to keep these outreach efforts as a key priority. We're going to continue to speak to the forums and groups that would like to learn more about how the river is operated and the challenges that recent hydrology presents. We will continue to hear from stakeholders as they help us identify the benefits and impacts the demand management program could present if we decide as a state the program is feasible. The takeaway here, as conversations on a potential demand management program continue across the Upper Basin and within Colorado, we want to stay informed by our water users and stakeholders. We would not develop such a potential program in a vacuum, but we will continue to assess concerns and preserve potential options and opportunities. Also moving forward, the state team will continue to work with our interstate partners on DCP efforts, keeping Colorado stakeholders informed and in the loop as these efforts continue. I'm going to ask Karen to come up to the microphone that I don't think is working and provide an update on the interstate DCP efforts.
Is it? Can you hear me? It sounded like it went down.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Karen Kwan, First Assistant Attorney General. So I'm going to just give an update of what's been going on the drought contingency plan from an interstate perspective. What is the drought contingency plan? What are the interstate documents? It's a package of documents, and this schematic is intended to try to highlight what all of the documents and how they fit together. They're a package of documents involving the Upper Basin states, the Lower Basin states, and the Department of Interior to set forth operations on the Colorado River system so we can protect critical elevations should a drought continue or worsen. As I have up here, there's more than 5 documents, but the key documents are the ones in dark purple, dark green, and blue. And so I'm calling them 5 documents. We have a lower basin drought contingency plan that consists of an agreement among the lower basin states and their main water user districts, or the people who have contracts out of Lake Mead with the Secretary of the Interior, of how they would protect Lake Mead's critical elevation of 1025 if the drought continues. Undoubtedly, it's a technical document. It has a lot of complexity of how they would get flexibilities in order to create water and put it into Lake Mead, but it is also obligatory on them. They will have to produce a certain volume of water at various elevations at Lake Mead to ensure that they can protect 1025 if the drought continues. And that's the plan, is that they have an agreement that sets it up among each other in the Department of Interior, and then they have the specific elements of what will happen under certain conditions spelled out and how the Secretary will operate the reservoir. That's been drafted and has been vetted through the 4 principles in the lower basin, including reclamation. And they are, I think, at a point close to being at a stage where they can say no more obstacles are in their way, and they are ready to discuss outreach of this document with everybody, their constituencies going forward. That's the lower basin side. We have the upper basin side. It's 2 documents. Now, we've referred to the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan, and then I'm saying there's 2 documents. There's 3 parts to the Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan. One of them is weather modification. It's not something that we need 7-state collaboration going forward or federal authorization for. So it's not part of the package that we're having to work out right now. So it's just not something we're talking about for this stage of discussions. So the 2 remaining documents are the Drought Response Operations Agreement, the Upper Basin Drought Response Operations Agreement, and Demand Management Storage Agreement. The Drought Ops Agreement is between the Upper Division states through the Commission and the Secretary of the Interior. It's intended to be able to coordinate with authority and participation by the Commission, so the Secretary is not acting on his own, sua sponte, to move water however they think, but they're coordinated with the Upper Basin states in determining when to move water from any of the upper crisp reservoirs, Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, or Navajo, to protect a critical elevation at Lake Powell if the drought continues. That critical elevation has been identified as 3525, and it's needed to potentially protect loss of minimum power at Lake Powell and help assure continued compact compliance. That's our first line of defense if this drought continues. We will move water that's available from those facilities to protect Lake Powell. The Drought Ops Agreement isn't limited to that. It would also try to figure out a way to recover the water, or make sure we can recover water that we have sent, so that no facility is forever drained or are having to catch up. And there's a lot of provisions to it. We, unlike the lower basin, who can say, if the elevation at Lake Mead is low, then these entities will provide X amount of water. That's a formula and a recipe that they can follow. Our problem is that our reservoir is below us, and we're not going to do something to make sure something might happen unless we have to. And we don't know what the situations at those facilities will be at that time. So we have to assess the conditions at the time that we are at risk and determine how to move water, whether it makes sense, whether we need to consider a lot of things. So the Drought Response Operations Agreement is a planning document that when we start to see that we could potentially hit 3525, we will start planning on developing a plan. We will start developing a plan of how we will engage people, how will we work together to move water and then recover the water back. It's not a decision, it's not a commitment of any volume of water at any specific time that the Upper Basin has to give to Lake Powell to ensure anything. But it is a plan that we are poised and ready to be able to act. That's the Drought Response Operations Agreement. The Demand Management Storage Agreement is not a demand management agreement. It is an interstate agreement, and the primary reason we need this is to secure the available storage at the CRISP facilities to be able to be available free of charge, so we don't have to pay for it if we ever did a demand management program. If we did a demand management program and we have nowhere to put the water, it's for naught. We did nothing. So if we can secure the water, the storage space, then we have incentive to be able to at least look into a demand management program. It would be free of charge, and it would be at the CRISP initial units, the federal authorization that we would be seeking. It would not be available unless we couldn't access that storage under this agreement, unless the commission requested its release for compact compliance purposes only. It can't be released to go to the lower basin under coordinated operations. It can't be released because we want to do a water banking thing among the upper basin states. It is for compact compliance purposes only, and it's only available for release at the request of the commission. That's the authorization we're seeking. The lower basin's a little bit concerned, and I don't disagree, that because it's kind of water outside of the system and it's being used or it's being stored in the facilities, they want to know and be sure that we're not, pardon the phrase, but gaming the system in some way by using this opportunity. So in addition to the authorization that we are seeking for securing storage, we have been negotiating minimum terms that would have to be in any demand management program so that we could get our heads wrapped around how it would work vis-a-vis the basins. For example, how big would an account be? 500,000 acre feet between now and 2025. Again, it would only be released if the commission released it. It is not subject to coordinated operations, but it is only water. Only water can be stored there if it has been used priorly and would have been used but for being in the program. Those kind of things are built into this. And that's what we've been negotiating, those types of terms, for the past 3 months. It does not establish an upper basin demand management program. There's a very good chance we won't have a demand management program, but it gives us the opportunity to have one if we want one. We are seeking federal legislation for the lower basins drought contingency plan, because the way it would work, they will potentially be otherwise butting up against the terms of the Boulder Canyon Project Act and the Arizona v. California decree. So they need federal authorization. Well, we need federal authorization too, and if we don't try to seek it in parity with the lower basin, we have lost our ability to get it in a timely manner with support from the lower basin. This is the opportunity that we have to do this, and it's now. It doesn't mean we have to do anything with it, but this is the time to secure it. That's the logic, at least, that everybody's been purporting. So those are the 4 documents that I've talked about. The 5th document is called a companion agreement in short term. And what that is that we have the lower basin has an agreement and the upper basin has agreements. We're only comfortable with the lower basin on the terms that we know. We don't want them to go change things or do something different, and vice versa. We're not signatory to their agreements and they're not signatory to ours. The companion agreement we're all signatory to, and it makes them all bind up to the companion agreement. That's the goal of that, is that we set out our rationale for support and what we would do to enforce it. The secretary would be subject to enforcement, all of those kind of things, and everybody would be a signatory to that document. That's the package of DCP that if we ever feel that it's necessary or ripe to go and be implemented, then we would go give that package to the Congress and have them federally endorse the package as a whole and be able to do this without interruption of claims or assertions against each other that it's against the law of the river. That's the concept. So Brent and I have been a little busy, as has Dr. Stolt, because we were in Las Vegas yesterday seeing where we are on all of this, because we've been working on drafting these so that the principals can see if it fits the scope or if there's any other obstacles that are in the way that we need to overcome. And thankfully, I'm here to report that as of yesterday, the principals have determined that the obstacles that we have been negotiating through between the basins, they don't see any more that we need to address. And that the concepts that are identified in the documents are sufficient enough in scope for us to call it good and not have any more discussion among each other about fights of how to figure this out. That doesn't mean they're done documents and they're all done written and everything, but from that perspective, there's enough comfort to be able to start talking about this in open so that we can get feedback. And the direction yesterday was that clean up the documents, because we have a lot of documents going. We need to make sure that they all have same letterhead and all of that kind of stuff. Get that stuff done by the beginning of October and start public outreach. And to that end, we had discussed that our anticipation is we'll bring these documents to the board. We'll bring these documents to the board hopefully the first week in October. And also this just happened yesterday, but our hope is that we can tentatively schedule a webinar, a public webinar by October 9th, that we can go through the documents for anybody's interest. In addition, at the same time, while Colorado does their things, everybody else is doing theirs, and the outreach will go. For the lower basin, for the entities who are directly responsible for providing water under the lower basin drought contingency plan, they have to have board approval. And so they're going to start laying the foundations and exploring the issues associated with that. Arizona, I'm sure you guys have heard, have been a little bit complex and how they're going to get this done, and they've been working through some issues. And they have indicated to us that while they can't say that they're on 100% path of getting to yes, they have confidence in where they're going and that they will be able to get there. So that's everybody in October will be working through getting outreach done and bringing the DCP documents to the board and having the public webinar. Similar things will be happening in the other by the other signatories. In October and November, if possible, they'll be obtaining approvals for committing to the obligations in the drought contingency plan in the lower basin, and the commission will confirm a path forward, the Upper Colorado River Commission, that is. And Interior has to do their own review as well. In November and December, Colorado River Water Users Association meeting is always the second week in December, and we always like to have the 7 states show that they've been actively involved in doing something. So I'm not surprised if we have some type of announcement that we are on a path forward to get the drought contingency plan done, if we're poised to do so. And at the same time, the lame duck session is probably the best option we have for federal legislation, we think. What vehicle, how, when, none of that is anywhere near. None of it has been thought of. But if we were proceeding forward, then it would likely be in November and December we would be talking to delegations. And then in January, even if Arizona is 100% on board, everybody's willing to sign, their legislature has to approve things. And their legislature doesn't get into session until January. And so that is the earliest Arizona could commit to anything on the DCP. So Arizona legislature provides approval to execute the documents. We have federal legislation, and then only will there be any signatures affixed to any documentation. Nobody is signing anything until then. So with that, that's the interstate perspective of the drought contingency planning documents. Demand management and what that looks like and going forward is something we have time to explore and need time to explore. And we have an outreach team that has been going, I think CWCB staff led by Brent has been phenomenal in this. I have to give some kudos. My staff has been in lockstep with Brent going and trying to bring this to people. So that's not changing, and that's going forward as well, starting next week. Continuing next week. And I don't anticipate that changing in 2019 either. It's going to continue. So that's the timeline we have. So what's the urgency? We just got a report out yesterday. The reservoirs are projected to be at 48% capacity by the end of the water year. That's compared to the 56% capacity of last year. We're on course to be the 3rd driest year on record on the Colorado River. We could be the 4th or 5th, but right now we're on record for the 3rd, or we're on course for the 3rd. August's inflow to Lake Powell was 2%. That's the only time it's been worse than that was 2002 when it was negative 50,000 acre feet. Lake Mead's shortage probabilities over 50%. The first time that could happen is 2020. The first possibility, I need to say this clearly, the first possibility, not probability, not likelihood, but that even the closest possibility of Lake Powell reaching 3525, that critical elevation, is 2020. If we don't have a drought contingency plan, what are we going to do? That's the question. So that's all I'm modeling. That's not forecasts that are certain or anything. I don't want to scare everybody, but we're planning for the worst. Hopefully it doesn't happen. We talk about it enough. Maybe it'll start raining and snowing immediately. I hope it does. But the reality is if we don't do something, something will be done to us. So that's where we are from an interstate perspective.
All right, I promise this is my last joke and my last anecdote. When I was in law school, we had this commercial that was on. It was this one attorney who would come on the screen and try to get you to give him his business. And this was his motto, one call, that's all. It was catchy, and we made a lot of fun of it in law school. But I just have to make one quick point about, as DCP continues to evolve, if you see something in a webinar, and this is for the board, this is for members of the public, this is for anyone who's listening in, if you read something in an Arizona newspaper or you hear something on a podcast and you think it does not line up or comport with what you've heard from a CWCB board member or staff member or any member of the Attorney General's office, please give us a call. We'd be thrilled to work through the issue with you, any other questions you might have. And if we can't answer them, we will conference call in Director Mitchell, Dr. Stolp, James Eklund, anyone it takes to get your question and your concern answered. And that said, I'm going to throw up this one quote from the memo that says a lot of pleasant things about cooperation and stakeholder input, and we're going to get the public testimony part of the agenda item rolling. Do you have the slips?
Yeah. So thanks, Brent and Karen. Are there any questions for Brent or Karen before we start here from the board? Okay, thanks. Oh, Director Anderson.
If Arizona's legislature doesn't act, that's the end of it. This can't move ahead, or could it move ahead like the 22 compact without Arizona?
There's always creative thinking to consider if one state isn't available. I'm going to say it like that because we are all working together going forward, but we have been in situations where we are not going to let one state fail the rest of us, hopefully.
Thank you. All right, we have several slips filled out for public comment, and if you want to comment, I'd ask you again to fill out this slip outside the door, and we'll call names. Turn your slip into Andrew right here, and so we'll get this going. And I just wanted to thank you for participating. I mean, this is what we do. So the CWCB has always been open, and we try to be as transparent as we can. And so this is how we do things in Colorado, and we're really setting the tone for the rest of the states as well. So I want to commend you on your passion for Colorado water, and I thank you for your participation. So we'll begin.
There's no name.
There's no name, but I think you can pick out who it is. It's Colorado River District and Southwest Water Conservation District. So if you want to take, and these say 5 minutes, we really would like to hear from you. And so, I'm not going to ring my cowbell at you or anything like that. So, I mean, but, we would ask, we have quite a few people here that want to speak. So we would just ask that you would try to be to the point. Thank you. And if you'd state your name and who you're with.
Yes, my name is Tom Alvey. I'm the president of the Colorado River District Board. I'm a director from Delta County, where I grow fruit and pack fruit. We would like to, I'll be brief in my comments, hopefully under 5 minutes, but we do have several other speakers with the River District who would like to address you, and with Southwestern. We have in the audience several of our board members, Steve Aquafresca from Mesa County, Al Vandenbrink from Rio Blanco, Tom Gray from Moffett. Let's see. But that seems to be the crew. And their representation here gives you an idea of how seriously we take this. This is an important topic to us, and we really appreciate the opportunity to have some public input. We also would like to thank the Conservation Board and the staff for the outreach that you have undertaken, and it's been quite successful. As Brent pointed out, you've been all over the state giving these presentations, getting information out to water users, and taking feedback. And we really appreciate that and think your staff has done a great job. We do have about 3 concerns that I'd just like to mention briefly, and then we'll fill in the details after I'm done. The first thing I'd like you to know is that we are supportive completely of drought contingency planning, and we're willing to have any discussion necessary about demand management. In fact, it's our districts who have taken the lead in identifying the problems that we are now addressing through contingency planning. So we recognize the importance of this discussion, and we commend the Conservation Board for having the discussion, and hope that we will continue to have input into it. In addition to recognizing the importance, which of course is tied to thing we have to remember above all, this is tied to avoiding a curtailment. That's why we're having these discussions. That's why it's important to Western Slope water users. So we want to stress that. We also want to say that it's important to our boards, and our boards stand united, the Southwestern Board as well as the River District Board, that we have some principles to guide the discussion as we go forward. Our fear is, as Western Slope water users, that we may become the target for demand management, and we want to do whatever we can to ensure that doesn't happen. Our idea for accomplishing that is that we have some sideboards and some principles agreed to before the discussions begin about how demand management will occur. So we've provided you, I think it's been distributed to the board, 6 principles that we would like you today to take action to publicly endorse. And in addition, as we continue the discussion about demand management and contingency planning, we would like to try to have open and transparent discussions in the spirit, consistent with the spirit of the Colorado Water Plan, aiming for consensus among all affected water users. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to my counterpart from the Southwestern District, Bob Wolf, and then if we could, we'll have a couple of our staff make further comments.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
If you'd state your name and who you're with, Bob. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your time. My name is Bob Wolf. I'm president of Southwestern Water Conservation District and the Animas La Plata Water Conservancy District. It's quite a way up here, and there are a number of our directors who are listening in live from home and from also the Dolores Water Conservancy District who opened up their boardroom today so that they could listen in. Thanks, Mike Preston. And also Don Schwint drove up from Cortez, former board member of yours. He's our representative from Montezuma County. Considering the statutory authority that our 2 boards have regarding the conservation and water development, we subsequently excuse me, see, that's what happens when I forget to read. First of all, I'd like to thank Becky, Brett, and Karen. They came down to our water seminar the 1st of April this year, and I think we were the trial run on DCP. Thanks for coming down. It really helps that you started to introduce the ideas of drought contingency planning to our area. Considering the statutory authority that our 2 boards have regarding conservation and water development, we subsequently have had 2 joint board meetings and have had board members present at 2 of each other's board intervening meetings to solidify our mutual interest. Today, there's virtually no space between our districts. It has not been easy, and I can tell you that I have board members who think it's a very slippery slope, albeit Western Slope, to consider a voluntary compensated and compact pool in Lake Powell, but we have managed to gain everyone's support at this point. Thanks to Brent, Karen, for clarifying your positions today. That really helped. And going back to what Tom said, we really need the 6 sideboards that we've worked so hard on prior to really any commitment of support from our boards, but we're fully willing and able to engage at any time. It sounds like a couple of you guys are coming down here in 2 weeks for a roundtable. Thanks again. General Counsel Peter Fleming from the Water District will elaborate on the 6 points.
All right. Thanks, Bob. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Chairman Jan. My name is Peter Fleming. I'm General Counsel at the Colorado River District in Glenwood Springs. Excuse me. I also want to thank the CWCB board, the CWCB staff, as well as the members of the Front Range Water Council, those that are here and those that are not, that have worked closely with the West Slope on trying to work out some sensitive issues. the CWCB staff has done a great job. I really want to give some kudos to Brent Newman, though. I think the clarifications he made today were very helpful. I hope this doesn't get too personal. I don't know where he is, but he has a way of calming a room, it seems like, and seems to be the right guy for the job. We are at, and hopefully we're getting over, I think, a little period of unfortunate tension. I've been doing this water stuff both on the Front Range in my former life, representing some of the folks that are here today even, and at the River District for a really too long of a period of time, a long period of time. And it seems like every once in a while these cycles come around where there's a bit of a flare up and a bit of a public airing of tension, and sometimes that happens, and sometimes it's unavoidable, and sometimes it just needs to be aired, and things, it happens, and we work through it. We've done it in the past in numerous circumstances, and I am confident, quite confident, that we will do it again. Everybody wants to avoid a compact curtailment. That's everybody's goal here today. We at the River District understand that a separate, non-equalized, non-balanced pool account, whatever you want to call it, in Lake Powell or the other upper basin CRISP facilities likely will be necessary, particularly if hydrology stays terrible. And so that's something that, is a new tool. It's a tool that can benefit the upper basin. It's a tool that will benefit the state of Colorado. But it is also, because it is a new tool, it comes with new fears, new concerns. And I think actually Brent put it quite well. It's I call it the unfettered use of that new tool. Brent referred to it when he talked about the staff's memo and the description of the things that have been discussed as the full range and spectrum of the options of what this tool could be used to do. And it is that full range and and spectrum of those options that is of concern to the West Slope. And I want to talk also a little about the timing. And why are we here today? Why is this a critical issue today when we've seen the timing that Karen thankfully walked through and was helpful? I get confused by the timing. I'm going to ask you for a copy of that slide because I still don't fully understand it, but it was helpful. And that is because not because we have a concern on the West Slope that those interstate documents, those documents that were discussed yesterday in Las Vegas, are going to set forth the specific criteria of what will constitute a demand management program within Colorado. But primarily because that is the document, and I forget the exact name of the document, but I think it's the demand management response document that will contain the blessing, so to speak, of this non-equalized, non-balanced storage account in Lake Powell. That is this new tool that causes this concern or triggers one of the concerns about a demand management program on the West Slope. And it's not just that tool. I shouldn't link it only to that. It is demand management. It's a controversial topic, and we can't shy away from that. The reduction of consumptive uses is something that is a new thing on the West Slope in particular. But to go back to the timing and the interstate v. intrastate documents, it's that the West Slope just is concerned about that full range and spectrum being brought to bear through whatever forces that, frankly, are out of our control once this pool becomes established. And that's sort of the timing trigger that is of most concern to us. It's not that we think that those interstate documents are going to, set one agenda versus the other. It's because they are unbridled. That interstate document is unbridled and doesn't have all of the parameters or I guess the minimum set of parameters that we would like to see. Has one or two, and those were helpful to hear. So that is why we ask that respectfully that the Water Conservation Board adopt as in some formal recognition. We've proposed a resolution, and you should have a copy attached to the memo or the letter that was sent to you just recently. A set of 6 guiding principles for how the state would implement a demand management program within Colorado. It's not to say that's how it has to operate in Wyoming or anywhere else, just within Colorado. It's also not to say that would be it. We recognize that there are a lot more details to hammer out. We know there's administrative issues. I think it was Brent alluded to the shepherding memo was one of the things that Ann Castle had put out. Things like that probably need to be hammered on and ironed out. We haven't set that forth in our set of principles. And I note that there is a large degree of overlap. We've noted it. I think everybody will have noted it between the principles that we request that this board formally adopt and the elements, if you will, that were described in the letter that you received from the Front Range Water Council. I'll go through them very quickly. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I don't want to spend much time on the specifics of those principles. They're set forth, and I hope they are understandable. They may or may not be self-explanatory, but I hope they are understandable. The pool, that is a separate, a non-equalized, non-balanced pool, should be free, and it should be used for the purposes of compact compliance. Karen talked about that those interstate documents will specify that, and we're happy to hear that. The pool will be non-equalized and non-balanced. It won't be subject to the interim guidelines or 602A. I think Karen noted that as well, and we're also happy to hear that. Based on contributions to that pool would be based on voluntary, temporary, and compensated reductions in consumptive uses. Those reductions in consumptive uses would not cause injury to other water rights. I think there's always an issue when you're shepherding flows downstream or you're injuring somebody else by doing so. That's simply a principle. The how you do it, that's something that comes down in the future. We also believe it's important that the contributions to that pool within the state of Colorado be roughly proportionate to the post-compact depletions of water users on the west slope and water users on the east slope, Trans Mountain water users. And the direct link to that is the compact itself, which talks about post-compact depletions and the state's obligation with respect to not depleting those post-compact water uses beyond a certain amount. By the by, those as of today, those post-compact depletions between the west slope and the Trans Mountain water users are roughly equal. It's not exact, but the basic principle is roughly proportionate. In addition, we think it is important that there be a reaffirmation that the contributions of water to and the use of the non-equalized pool, non-balanced pool, be consistent with the principles 1 through 7 that are set forth in the conceptual framework of Colorado's water plan. And we can talk about that a little bit more if you would like. We believe, and there are very strong feelings about this on the west slope, and it's a difficult and it's sometimes nuanced issue. I hope we don't have to get into the weeds about it, but we think it is appropriate that because we believe all of these 6 elements are fully consistent with Colorado's water plan, fully consistent with the public discussions that the Colorado River District and the Southwestern District have had to date with their constituents, that the CWCB staff has had throughout the state on this idea, that uses outside of those 6 general principles, to the extent that it ever becomes necessary, and nobody hopes that it will. I don't think anybody is desirous of that. But to the extent that that does become necessary, we believe that it is appropriate that that would be based on a consensus process. And we were happy to hear Brent talk about consensus and outreach on other means of contribution, other uses of a non-equalized pool, of a demand management program. I could quote you from the water plan. I'm not going to do that right now, but if you want to, I could point you to where it says this demand management program will be all of these things. One more point before I turn it over, and again, I appreciate your time very much. We're going to stay at the table. The West Slope, the River District, Southwest District, we're going to work hard to make this work for all of the state. This really isn't about us versus them versus us. This is about a new tool that has caused some angst, caused some concern, excuse me. And to the extent there are additional hiccups coming down the road, we're going to be willing to sit down and talk with everybody in as earnest and as meaningful and as helpful input as we can. With that said, we do have a very strong, a unified position on the West Slope that we believe it is appropriate, that given the tough situations on the West Slope with respect to the relative economic might, the relative or lack thereof, the relative lack thereof of political power within the state, the growing economic power of the Front Range, that some degree of these parameters be formally recognized. And with that, I will close, and I thank you for your time.
All right. Thanks,
I
Peter.
would like to act, if I believe either Beth Van Verst, Counsel for Southwestern, and Bruce Whitehead, Southwestern's General Manager, may have some comments as well.
Yeah, that's fine. Welcome, Beth.
Hi.
Please state your name and who you're with.
My name is Beth Van Verst. I serve as outside general counsel for the Southwestern Water Conservation District. Thank you for providing us with the opportunity to speak today and express our concerns. Now that the River District's General Counsel has explained the West Slope Conservation District's requests and why we are making them, I thought it'd be worthwhile to take a step back and look at the 2 letters that you've received from the Front Range Water Council and the West Slope Conservation Districts, just to highlight what I think are the few, maybe 3 key differences right now between the approaches that we're taking. First, the 2 sides vary with regard to what they're requesting of the CWCB today. The Front Range Water Council is making recommendations regarding how Colorado ought to participate in a demand management program that makes use of a new storage account in Lake Powell or one of the other initial units. The West Slope is asking the CWCB to commit to 2 things. The first is the basic framework, that's the 6 principles that Peter described, within which Colorado will participate in a voluntary, temporary, compensated demand management program that the Upper Basin is committing to explore when it endorses the Upper Basin DCP. And second, we are asking the state to confirm that any other uses of or methods of contributing to that new demand management pool or this new demand management program are going to be made using this consensus-based approach that involves the 2 conservation districts as well as many other stakeholders. We think it's necessary and prudent for the CWCB to make this commitment now so that the West Slope water users and their communities have some level of confidence that the program is going to be run, if it is eventually stood up, in the way in which it has been publicly presented. Second, the two sides vary with regard to the scope of the input that they're providing. The Front Range Water Council's input, as best I can tell, is geared more towards the creation and use of this new storage account. I say that because there's statements in their letters about they recommend that these principles guide Colorado as they adopt a program for use of this upper division storage account. In contrast, the 6 principles that the West Slope conservation districts are asking the state to adopt, they apply only to the continued exploration of this voluntary, compensated, temporary demand management program. Our boards have not taken a position on any other sort of program or use of this demand management pool. And we haven't done so because the demand management program that's currently being considered by the UCRC, as we understand it, has always been publicly presented to be a voluntary one. Peter alluded to the fact that you could look to a number of different sources to see that this has always been touted as a voluntary, temporary, compensated program, and we can certainly run through that. I actually did think it was worth reading part of the water plan. So I'm glad Peter didn't steal my thunder there. And I think it's useful because from my perspective, the statement that's in the Colorado Water Plan about demand management, it talks about the program being voluntary, not insofar as the state choosing to participate. Certainly that's one element, that Colorado has to approve participation in that program. But it really gets to the fact that the contributions were only to be expected from willing participants. It wasn't supposed to happen through mandatory curtailment. So in the state water plan, and this is in section 9.1, it talks about demand management efforts would be based on voluntary, temporary, and compensated reductions in eastern and western slope consumptive use, that willing water users would be temporarily compensated for voluntary reductions in consumptive use, and such reductions in use would be monitored and verified to ensure a benefit to the Colorado River system. The UCRC resolution passed in 2014 similarly describes this program as a temporary, voluntary, compensated one. And as best I can tell, just from reviewing all of the different UCRC annual reports that have come out since then, they've continued to refer to this as a voluntary program. The third and final difference between what appears to being advanced by the Front Range Water Council and the conservation districts is that the Front Range Water Council appears to be trying to open the door to the possibility of Colorado requiring its water users to participate in a demand management program. This attempt is made clear through statements in their letter, providing that Colorado should, as a first priority, fill through voluntary, temporary, compensated contributions. Then they go on to offer to work with the state to develop an alternative mechanism for generating conserved water, which again is really just a reduction in consumptive use. And they affirm their commitment to work with the state engineer on any rulemaking that's necessary regarding the administration of water rights or potentially curtailment. The push from the Front Range to develop a program where curtailed water could be stored is really, it's not surprising. The Front Range has been asking the state to engage in conversations related to curtailment for quite some time. For example, as some of you may recall, the Front Range submitted a number of comments on the state water plan. In the comments that they submitted in September of 2015, they recommended that the state develop a policy governing the future administration and curtailment of Colorado River diversions. We recognize that discussions about curtailment are likely going to occur, and they may occur soon. But those discussions should not occur within the context of what has always been described as a voluntary, temporary, compensated program. Instead, if the states decide to go forward with those types of discussions, we would ask that they occur outside of this context and instead before the roundtables, before our districts, and in other forums where water users can more openly participate. And with that, unless there's any questions, I'll turn this over to Southwest's Executive Director.
All right, thank you, Beth. We'll go ahead and welcome Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Bruce Whitehead, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southwestern Water Conservation District. I'm also a member of the Southwest Basin Roundtable and on the IBCC. And, you know, I was asked to kind of wrap up the thoughts of the combined comments from the two districts, and it's well said, is what I would say to everybody that presented. And I would also like to echo my appreciation for the staff and the outreach and even the summary today. These aren't easy topics that we're dealing with. And I think what we're dealing with now is going to impact and affect the future of Colorado, as well as all the other 6 states in the Colorado River system. Our district was formed in 1941, and there are statutory authorities in there that came with the formation of that district. Very similar to the Colorado River District that was formed in 1937. And it was to protect, conserve, use, and develop, and safeguard, in our case, all waters of the San Juan and Dolores and San Miguel rivers. The River District has almost identical language in their statutes, and it's really not, in some ways, much different than what the Colorado Water Conservation Board has in theirs. So when people asked why we were at the table, why we were participating, why we were arm in arm, is we share similar interests. We share similar interests throughout the state. I've told people in regards to Colorado River issues in Colorado that we're all connected by plumbing. It's very simple. There's uses on both sides of the Continental Divide. There's pre-compact uses and there's post-compact uses. And so the question has come up is, how are those districts different, or why are those views maybe somewhat different than the Front Range Water Council and what has been put into their letter, added to their letter? And the two districts collectively represent the entire western slope, again, to safeguard, protect those uses. I spent the first 4 years probably of my career at Southwestern District trying to get away from the Colorado River District represents the entire west slope. And now here I am. Now Southwestern is representing the interests of the west slope along with the River District. And they are consistent. And I think it was said there isn't much space between us. We have had a number of board meetings. We've signed a cooperative agreement between the two districts because these are somewhat controversial discussions. I think the difference is due to that statutory charge and the two districts representing all of the counties on the west slope. In southwest parts, it's all or parts of 9 counties. The River District is all or part of 15 counties. And those duties in the statute through our state legislature to protect and safeguard those interests, it's a little bit different. It takes in all of the Colorado River system west of the Continental Divide and their tributaries versus some of the individual users and members, all very valid concerns and interests, but protecting individual water rights or individual projects in the case of the Front Range water users. There's been some discussions as recent as in the hall walking in here saying, why weren't we at the table? And I can tell you, we have heard the same thing on the west side of the Continental Divide. And our answer to that is, it's because that's our statutory charge. So I think you've heard the asks, but I think it's worth talking a little bit more, not for very long, I promise. But we are looking for some protections or some certainty prior to the state of Colorado entering in and approving a drought contingency plan that we all agree is necessary, but we think there needs to be sideboards that provide those protections. And those are the 6 points that are outlined in the letter that you received. But we think that needs to be done prior to that to provide some certainty to the folks, our constituents on the Western Slope that we represent. Our board, our Southwestern board, and I think it was true in the meetings I sat in with the River District board, we're not terribly enthused about the idea of a pool at all being, an account being created in Lake Powell, because they thought that just opened up the door for the dry up of West Slope agriculture. And through the excellent outreach by your staff, by the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the Attorney General's office, they came around because this was demand management portion of the drought contingency plan. They were assured it was to be voluntary, compensated, and temporary. And with that, they thought that it was important to move forward with approval of the drought contingency plan as long as we can achieve that certainty. I think you've heard that beyond that, and in mention of the comparison between the two letters, there are some very discrete differences. However, there are a lot of points that we agree on with the Front Range. And it's unfortunate that maybe it's time driven, that we didn't have a little more time to resolve those issues. But as you heard in Karen's, Ms. Kwan, presentation, this is driven by time. And so we all came to a point where we felt our positions needed to be heard. I would also note that you've received, I hope they've been distributed, but there have been other letters written in support of the documents that we submitted to you. And that includes the Gunnison Roundtable, and I think there's a representative from the Roundtable that will speak here today. The Southwest Basin Roundtable, and you mentioned, somebody mentioned Mike Preston has opened his office so folks could participate in the web broadcast of this, as well as the Colorado River District has supported those the Colorado River Basin Roundtable. And so the 3 roundtables, and then the 4th is the White Yampa. And I believe that there's a representative here today to address your board as well. There's also a letter of support for those concepts in there from Club 20. Club 20 is an active group on the Western Slope that addresses energy issues, water issues, transportation issues. But they too see this as a very important issue, not only for the Western Slope, but for Colorado. I think I'm going to note again what is being requested in the letter that the two conservation districts provided is consistent with the UCRC resolution, that this is temporary, compensated, and voluntary. It's also consistent with all of the public presentations. And now as you have more discussions, other things get discussed on the side, things come up, they end up in staff memos, not necessarily to say you were headed that way, just to note that those had come up in discussions. And I think when we went beyond the voluntary compensated and other entities, and to be clear, it wasn't our districts that brought up anything about moving towards curtailment or using this pool that could be established to prevent a compact curtailment to be used the other way and to actually be used for curtailment. We know that could happen. We want to have future discussions, and we believe this board can give some direction to that so that it's a consensus-driven process that includes all of our roundtables throughout the state, as well as the IBCC. It was also noted that this is consistent with Colorado's water plan. And the other protection we are asking for is just to make sure the West Slope agriculture in these initial phases and possible implementation of a demand management program do not unfairly target West Slope agriculture. It's in the water plan and other documents in the CWCB presentations, Attorney Generals, that this is a statewide problem and that burden should be shared throughout the state. And we agree with that, and I think most people probably would. So the ask again is our intent was to work through with some of the other interested parties and come up with some kind of an agreement that everybody could live with. an MOA, some kind of a document that hopefully even the state agreed to. That option was removed from the table, not by the Western Slope. So that was our goal. You'll see there's some consistency between the letters. So that made it very difficult. But we think, absent that, unless the state is willing to enter into an agreement with the two conservation districts and other interested parties in advance of a demand management or drought contingency plan being approved by this board, that the resolution was proposed, at least to publicly reaffirm what has been out there and being presented to all of our constituents. I think to wrap it up, well, at least our portion of this is really the beginning of a bigger process for even establishing a voluntary demand management program. And I believe, and I think my board is 100% behind, as well as the River District, but that it's imperative to adopt a public recognition prior to Colorado entering into or supporting a drought contingency plan or seeking federal legislation. So we could be looking at an easy fix, some type of recognition publicly by this board, preferably in a resolution that is in draft form. I'm sure you would have some other input into that, but we'd encourage you to strongly consider that. I think we don't want to get into the issues that some of the other states are dealing with and may deal with here before a drought contingency plan is approved by all of the states. So thank you for your time. Thanks to all the people that are putting efforts into this, including the Attorney General's office, all very difficult issues. And we appreciate the discussion directly with the Conservation Board, with our partners at the Front Range Water Council, with staff at CWCB, Attorney General's office, and our commissioners and alternate commissioners through the Colorado River. I think the message needed to be brought forward. We appreciate the public forum in order to do that. And with that, I think we would answer any questions, either of myself or anybody else that's presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. So I think we might go ahead and if you have any questions of Tom or Bob or Peter or Beth or Bruce as a board. If not, we'll continue on.
Mr. Chair, can I mention one more thing?
Absolutely.
I thought it was a bit ironic that you put this in as agenda item number 13.
I thought the same thing, Bruce. We're on the same page. We have agreement.
All right, there you go.
All right.
I knew we could reach agreement, Jim. Thank you.
All right, so we'll continue on. We have some of the Front Range Water Council representatives. So Jim Lockhead, Denver Water. Thank you for making the trek.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. My name is Jim Lockhead. I'm the CEO manager of Denver Water. And just initially for the record, I thought the staff memo was fine. I read it as described by Brent, and so it was fine by me. Just so there's no doubt about the stake of Denver Water serving a quarter of the state's population in the Colorado River. I think everybody on this board realizes the fact that Denver Water secures about half of our water supply from the Colorado River Basin, and the vast majority of the water rights that provide that service are post-compact water rights. So we, along with other members of the Front Range Water Council, stand to be curtailed essentially completely half of our water supply in the event of a compact curtailment, which is why we have pressed forward very strongly for a proactive approach by the state of Colorado in cooperation with the other basin states and the Department of the Interior toward avoiding a compact call from happening in the first place. We also recognize that as Denver Water has something at risk with the Western Slope, we would expect to contribute with the Western Slope and with the rest of Colorado to that solution. We are not looking to shirk that responsibility. But as we approach the 20th year of the current drought, there really shouldn't be a doubt about the seriousness of the circumstances that we face as a state. In the negotiation of the 1922 compact and since, Colorado has led the basin in developing far-sighted solutions that protect our state and that also benefit the greater good of the American West. And it is time for Colorado to continue to lead. There are some who may say that the Upper Basin is in no danger of a compact violation in the near future, that we have time to work through these issues. There may be those who would say that the lower basin is overusing its allocation, so we should rely on the law to protect us. But both of these arguments, in my judgment, ignore reality. The fact is that we are potentially a few short years away from the 10-year running average at Lee's Ferry dropping close to levels that will put critical compact issues at risk. And you have a handout in front of you of a bar chart that illustrates that. You can see from the bar chart that although average releases over the last 10 years have averaged about 9 million acre feet a year, I think the current running average is about 92 million acre feet for the 10-year running average. That average is driven by the year 2011, which in 5 years or so will drop off of the 10-year running average. And so with current hydrology continuing, within about a 10-year period, that running average could hit close to 82.5 million acre feet, which of course means a compact question comes to the fore. I would also note that although there's been a lot of discussion about 9 million acre foot releases, including in a letter that Denver Water wrote to the Central Arizona Project regarding their efforts to find the sweet spot in Lake Powell releases, what happens in these averages is that those 9 million acre foot releases get balanced by 7.48 million acre foot releases and even 7 million acre foot releases as Lake Powell reaches critically low elevations. And it essentially takes 2 of those 9 million acre foot years to balance off a 7.48 or a 7.0. So as we get lower and as those releases get lower, the rush to that 82.5 million acre feet or lower gets faster as Lake Powell gets lower. Another fact is that with a repeat of historic hydrology beginning in the year 2000, Lake Powell will be dry. And when I say dry, I mean empty within about 3 years. If you doubt this possibility, as Karen Kwan noted, just note the fact that the August runoff was 2% of normal. You have another handout in front of you which illustrates Lake Powell elevations, assuming that hydrology started with the year 2000, repeats itself starting today. And as you can see, the red line illustrates basically Lake Powell running empty in about 3 years. The blue line illustrates a demand management program as modeled by the state, the UCRC, the River District, and a number of others. I think that's a pretty common chart that shows that a demand management program actually does help. But in this particular case, a demand management program doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It still doesn't prevent Lake Powell from running below minimum power pool. So we may need, I know we don't want to implement, but we may need other mechanisms to accelerate the creation of water into Lake Powell in the event of an emergency. The mere prospect of these events argues that it would be foolish to do nothing and wait until we are in a crisis. I certainly hope we don't have to implement any countermeasures to an extended drought. This is not something that Denver Water wants or is asking for. What we're asking for is that the contingency plans be put in place. And if we do, we need to have those plans in place before the system collapses. The lower basin is moving forward with difficult discussions toward drought contingency planning that, if successful, will put over 1 million acre feet of water in Lake Mead over and above the shortages that they will be taking, possibly starting in 2020, as Lake Mead reaches critically low elevations. They hope to complete that process by year end. I would also acknowledge the lower basin needs to continue to do more. The drought contingency plan in the lower basin doesn't solve the structural deficit problem that the lower basin faces. So we need to work together with the lower basin to continue to work toward that structural deficit. But they've also acted. In the last 2 years, total water use in the lower basin has been substantially less than the 7.5 million acre feet to which they're entitled under the decree in Arizona v. California from the main stem. But that's not to say that we should rely on the lower basin. Colorado and the other upper basin states must act to control our own destiny. If the lower basin can conclude its negotiations, implementation of the lower basin DCP would require federal legislation. And in our interests, in Colorado's interests, given the situation in the upper basin I described earlier, This is not an opportunity we can afford to let pass. As Karen Kwan noted, a train is going to Washington, D.C. in the form of federal legislation. We should be on that train or we will miss an opportunity, a really valuable and critical opportunity for Colorado and the rest of the Upper Basin to have a storage account in Lake Powell that would be available to us if and when a demand management account or program could be created. Having been in official positions on behalf of the state of Colorado, it is the state's obligation through its UCRC commissioner and through the CWCB to negotiate these interstate matters on behalf of and in consultation with all users of Colorado River water in the state, East Slope and West Slope. I believe the state has continued to meet that obligation and the state has done a good job. The state of Colorado has engaged with the Upper Colorado River Commission, Lower Basin states, and the Department of the Interior, as it has always done, in the discussion of drought contingency planning in the Upper Basin. This involves a number of difficult issues, but consists of moving water from CRSP reservoirs and, if necessary, managing demands in the Upper Basin to meet our obligations under the compact. There is simply no other way to do it. So the question becomes, how do we do it? And when do we put the mechanisms in place? These questions are interdependent. We can act either proactively or we can act reactively. We can protect ourselves together or we can fight amongst ourselves and leave ourselves to the potential of federal intervention to solve a crisis, or the prospect of a competition for water in Colorado that nobody wants to see. From Denver Water's perspective, we prefer to be proactive. We are willing to engage in discussions with the state and other water entities on both sides of the divide to develop the best strategy for Colorado as a whole. As a result, we have joined with other water utilities in the Front Range in supporting the state's efforts to authorize the release of water from CRSP reservoirs to Lake Powell and to establish a demand management account in Lake Powell in the event a demand management program is necessary. And we support the federal legislation to make that happen. I also want to recognize that we would like to see and we prefer a voluntary compensated temporary program. That should be the first priority. I also don't think that by not talking about mandatory curtailment, we can pretend and the problem will go away. We need to be thinking about that and we need to be thinking about it proactively. Our position as expressed in the Front Range Water Council letter to the CWCB, and I won't repeat that, but I would say that casting rhetoric aside and casting conspiracy theories aside, you will see substantial agreement between the Front Range Water Council letter and the letter submitted by the Western Colorado districts. We believe that those two letters on behalf of most of the water users of Colorado River water in Colorado together give the board a lot of meat to work with in terms of formulating a path forward. There's a lot of common ground there. There was a recent press account of the Western Slope position as being a West Slope manifesto. From Denver Water's perspective, I don't believe we need manifestos. What we need is diplomacy and what we need is leadership. It's no coincidence that the two letters express a lot of common ground. That's because we've been talking to each other. They express really the substance of the discussions that we've already had. So these are in essence common positions that we express to you. However, I also urge the board to not unduly constrain the state's negotiating position. Do not get hung up on platitudes and rhetoric that will hamper the state's position in the future. We do not believe that a resolution of this board is necessary at this point in time. You have the positions, you can formulate a path forward, and I believe that through continued discussions in the state of Colorado, we can establish a path forward in this state. So as a result, we believe that the state should move forward with the DCP. We believe the state should move forward with the establishment of a storage account in Lake Powell that will allow us to store water for the benefit of the entire Upper Basin and the entire state of Colorado. We support the legislation, and we also urge the CWCB and the state engineer to move forward with urgent and robust discussions within Colorado, given the timeframes that we're operating under, so that we can participate and agree on sustainable management of the basin without sacrificing any region or economic sector in this state. I also want to make clear that the state may not have the luxury of having agreement from every party, including the Front Range Water Council or Denver Water. But at some point, the state is going to have to step up and lead. And I urge you to continue to do that. And Denver Water stands ready to work with you and the rest of Colorado toward our mutual goal of protecting the economic viability of the state. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Kathy Kitzman with Aurora Water. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Yan and members of the board. My name is Kathy Kitzman. I'm a water resources principal with Aurora Water. The Colorado River supplies 25% of the drinking water source for the city of Aurora, and we are one of 7 of the Front Range Water Council members. And I'm simply going to say that Aurora supports CWCB and the state of Colorado's activities and efforts on this matter. We support going forward with obtaining the drought response operations agreement and going forward with the demand management plan storage agreement. We support CWCB in creating the opportunity to get that storage over these last couple years, and hope that you guys seize the opportunity today and don't wait for all of the negotiations to come up with solid guidelines and points to adhere by. I have faith in the opportunity and the process to come with the stakeholder process, and Aurora is looking forward to being an active participant in that matter. So thank you. If there's no other questions, I'll turn this over to the next person.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
We have Patrick Wells with Colorado Springs Utilities.
Not to be confused with Patty Wells.
Yeah, not Patty Wells, Patrick Wells.
Yes, not to be confused with Patty Wells, but good afternoon. My name is Patrick Wells. I am the general manager for water resources and demand management for Colorado Springs Utilities. Appreciate the opportunity to share a few words and would like to echo the comments of Mr. Lockhead and Ms. Kitzman regarding a proposed path forward. Colorado Springs is the second largest municipal water provider in the state of Colorado. We serve roughly 500,000 residents in the Pikes Peak region. Sorry, my watch is buzzing. We obtain roughly 70% of our water supply from the Colorado River Basin. That includes the first use of the water and subsequent reuse to extinction. So that water supply is very important to our region and our economic vitality. We recently completed our integrated water resource plan in 2017, where we took a long look at the Colorado River Basin supplies and in evaluating our water supply risks and how to mitigate those risks. And it became very clear through tens of thousands of model runs and looking at hundreds of different hydrologies that this is indeed our number one risk for the region and the number one risk that we face as a state. So in the interest of mitigating risk, I agree with the comments that have been made about we need to be proactive. We need to be considering the worst case scenarios. We need to be considering what happens if the hydrology that's occurred over the last 17 years repeats itself, and potentially even worse, the last 5 years. If that repeats itself, where will we be? And so we need to be developing tools and projects and methods that allow us to manage our supplies, allow us to be proactive. And we understand that those tools can be scary. There's always a lot of uncertainty when something new gets rolled out, but I think we'd be irresponsible not to have these discussions. Speaking to sequencing, Colorado Springs Utilities believes it is important for the CWCB to take a leadership role, work with the UCRC, work with the upper and lower basin stakeholders to first solve the interstate issues and reach agreement on the principles on a big river basis. And then from there, once we have some parameters established around the agreements that Ms. Kwan described, we can then, for instance, if we know that there is an ICS account available in Powell, from there we can start the discussion around how we best manage that as a state and what common principles we can agree to between the west slope and the east slope and all water users. So as far as sequencing, I think we fully support the board's and the state of Colorado's momentum and movement towards reaching agreement on these important documents. And then we will be active participants in the discussions regarding how drought contingency planning and how a future demand management program may work. So with that, I would, unless anyone has any questions, I'd like to close with those remarks.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Lee Miller with the Southeastern Colorado Water Conservancy District. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Lee Miller. I'm the General Counsel for the Southeastern Colorado Water Conservancy District. With me today is Jim Broderick, who's the Executive Director of the Southeastern District. I wanted to start by thanking Brent and Lane Leoniak for coming to Southeastern at my request and doing a presentation. You saw the list. We were on that list. I appreciate the time that they spent. Also appreciate the work that they've done, both the Attorney General's Office and CWCB staff, through the process of trying to address the issues that have been raised by the DCPs, both in the lower and the upper basin. I'm going to try and be brief because we're going on for quite some time. So I'll start by saying that I'd like to affiliate us with the comments that Jim Lockhead and Pat Wells and others have made from the Front Range Council. I want you to know that Southeastern, and I personally, I've been working on variations of this issue clear back to the water bank, and I was thinking about this morning back to when DNR Director Russell George put together a group to try and address water issues. I was on that group. I also got a adverse editorial from the Pueblo chieftain that they didn't think that I could both represent Southeastern and participate in that group. So it's been these kinds of issues have been around for a long time, and the way that people view them varies from time to time. But I wanted to say that we're committed to work to try and work out all the issues that are raised in the demand management. What we don't need right now is someone to draw a line in the sand that says you can't go forward with a proposal that really has probably one chance to come forward without meeting all of our demands. That I don't believe is productive. So let me just say that you have the September 13th letter. Jim Broderick was amongst the many people who signed that letter. It lays out the principles that the Front Range Council was willing to put forward as recommendations to you, rather than telling you what to do. We tried to tell you what we think you should do, and we wanted to keep that in that form, and that was very important to some of our membership. I think that really when you kind of put it all together, there are three things that any demand management program has to have. One thing is it has to be uniform. Everyone is treated in the same fashion. That way that we all are protected or disadvantaged to the same degree. I think that what you put forward has to be flexible. Understand, as Karen's pointed out to you, that we're really at the beginning edge of this. We're trying to get the demand management storage space in place so that the UCRC can have discussions about what a interstate for upper basin program would look like. And then as we understand what the parameters of that are, then Colorado needs to move forward with the program that it has. So we have to have a policy position that is flexible so that we're able to address a changing and uncertain environment. And of course, the last point is obvious. It has to be in the best interests of all the water users in the state of Colorado. These are the programs that we're committed to. This is the policy that we believe is appropriate for this board to consider, to move forward with and adopt. I'd also like to, at this point, say that the Pueblo Water was unable to send a representative because of conflicting meeting, but they also support the demand management program. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
All right. Thanks, Lee. We'll continue on. We have Brad Wind with the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. Looks like you're being followed. Welcome, Brad. Welcome, Brad.
Good afternoon, Jim, Mr. Chairman and board. Yeah, I'm being followed. He's got cowboy boots on. He probably can't kick me from here. My name is Brad Wind. I'm general manager for Northern Water and its municipal sub-district. As many of you might know, Northern Water is a significant diverter in the upper Colorado River. Between the two districts, Northern Water diverts about 240,000 acre feet per year on average. That water is utilized by roughly just shy of 1,980,000 individuals directly or indirectly in northeastern Colorado, as well as about 640,000 irrigated acres as a supplemental supply. First of all, I want to applaud the board for its leadership and leadership of its staff for serving up a legal framework and drafting those documents to ultimately allow for a non-equalizing pool in initial CRISP units. I found myself new to this job in a series of meetings over the course of the last 4 or 5 months, being in some cases a sole engineer, surrounded by attorneys, talking about a lot of legal theory. And Mr. Chairman, as you can, I think, relate, in being a fellow ag engineer, you got to find a way to simplify this stuff. So in doing so, I think about analogs to this situation we find ourselves in that makes sense to this ag engineer. So my analog is a multi-tool. You've all seen these devices. They look pretty slick on the shelf. I've carried this for nearly 30 years on most Saturdays when I'm playing farmer in northeastern Colorado, not far, Mr. Chairman, from your homeland. And they're a prickly device. If you've ever used one, they tend to pinch your hand, but they provide functionality in a bind. So my analog is that someday, I hope within the next couple of years, if Mother Nature continues down this path, that we'll have a multi-tool, a pool in PAL and associated demand management programs or a program to provide water to that pool. I might go as far as suggest that there might be 2 versions of this tool, one related to voluntary compensated water, if such funds become available. I'd encourage you to also think at the same time about what this tool might look like in terms of a mandatory program going forward. But again, this tool has found me out of a lot of binds in the middle of nowhere. Ideally, I'd like to have a 1,200 craftsman piece tool set. We don't have the resources in Colorado to provide that. It doesn't exist. So this happens, I hope, in a couple of years. I'd encourage you to be aggressive about how we move forward. But where we are today, in my mind, is serving up draft documents that allow you to put a couple strips of steel into a forge. And over some amount of time, those strips become red hot. And you'll get the green light with these legal documents signed and sealed in federal legislation to pull those 2 pieces of steel out of the forge, and inviting Northern Water, Front Range Water Council, beneficiaries of Colorado River Water and stakeholders east and west slope to help you temper, pound, forge what are 2 pieces of steel into a multi-tool or tools to allow us to get through the challenge that we have in front of us. So in conclusion, I just want to encourage CWCB to continue their leadership role in not only the federal legislation, but quickly thereafter, I'm being optimistic perhaps, quickly thereafter, providing a forum for all of us to come together and start pounding. It'll be hard work, it'll be sweaty work, but at some point we've got to have some tools to manage the conditions we find ourselves in. And with that, I'd like to invite Bennett Rayleigh, General Counsel for Northern Water, to make some comments.
All right, welcome, Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple brief observations. With respect to Brad's tool, I would submit that the issue of whether or not the state moves to a voluntary plan for meeting its compact obligations or a mandatory one is not in the sole control of anyone in this room. If the drought continues, there's two paths. If there's an infinite source of money, then voluntary works. Great, we're all happy. If the drought continues and there's not an infinite source of money, then the state will go to mandatory. The Supreme Court will ensure that sooner or later. It's not a question. So the question is, do we have this tool in place, whether it's voluntary or mandatory, to stop extra water from going down to the lower basin? I'd offer that that tool is incredibly valuable regardless of which course we want to take. The other brief comment I want to make, and I actually have a pretty sordid past, twice on Senate staff and once in Interior. The thought that you, as a sovereign, can or should commit that the state's compliance with an interstate compact should be subject to consensus, I find stunning. I draw an analogy to the Colorado River. If consensus were required on the Colorado River, California would not have been shut down to 4.4 million acre feet. It would not have happened. There would not be a Colorado River delivery agreement. I'd submit there probably wouldn't be 07 guidelines for sharing shortages, because at the end of the day, what forces those consensus actions is the knowledge that if the parties don't reach agreement between themselves, the sovereign will do what's best for the interests of the people they represent. So I find it stunning to suggest that you give away that sovereignty, unless, of course, you want to give it to Northern. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Brad. Are there any questions? That's the Front Range Water Council. Any questions from the board? All right, so we'll continue on. Kathleen Curry, who is for and against. So welcome, Kathleen.
Well, I wouldn't say that, actually. I just wasn't sure
You
which
marked it.
boxes to mark, so I did both. My name is Kathleen Curry. I'm from Gunnison, Colorado. I represent 3 different entities today: the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District and the Gunnison Basin Roundtable, and our family cattle and hay operation. The first thing I'd like to say is that I affectionately refer to the staff memo as the Hornet's Nest memo, and that's really what motivated us to come today, motivated our Gunnison Basin Roundtable to talk about these issues. We had a presentation and are thankful that Brent came out in July, just a short 2 months ago, and he explained to us what the state's strategy was with regard to this whole concept of demand management and the DCP process. We were assured that we were looking at a voluntary, temporary, compensated scenario for the water that could eventually be put into storage. Subsequent to that, we learned about the federal legislation being proposed and discussed and being hashed through. The Upper Gunnison District and the Gunnison Roundtable are supportive of the concept. We're supportive of being part of a solution and not just part of the problem. And we would like to make it clear that both entities support the resolution language that was provided by the two conservation districts to you all. And I don't know if you've had a chance to read it, but my understanding is you do have that. So the only thing that's missing really in that resolution, though, would be the role of the Basin roundtables. And I would like to encourage the CWCB to consider involving the roundtables as a stakeholder in this process. They're just such a great forum for getting the word out, for communicating to the basins, because everyone's represented, the different types of water users and the major water players are all there at the table. So I would encourage you to reach out and communicate, continue with that for the individual roundtables. I'm going to take my hat, those two organizational hats off, because we're doing a lot of general speak here today and talk to you as a water user, as an agricultural water user on the West Slope in possession of both junior and senior water rights using the 1922 cutoff date. And what we have at stake is not whether there's going to be a curtailment at one of the Trans Mountain diversion tunnels, which might result in a water user on the Front Range having to irrigate their lawns once a week instead of twice a week, or maybe another subdivision can't be approved, or maybe a supplemental agricultural water supply would be impacted. This is our livelihood. This water is what we depend on. We count on those seniors. We count on those juniors. Our economies count on that. If we move in the direction of mandatory curtailment, and if it isn't equitable, and if we go down that path, you're going to have significant impacts to the water users in the state of Colorado. And I can't stress that enough, especially on the Western Slope. I mentioned I want to be part of the solution, but I guess I'll close with this statement that I hope that the treatment isn't worse than the disease. We are so worried about forestalling compact curtailment, but at what expense? Turn the appropriation doctrine on its head? Significantly impact the viability of agriculture on the Western Slope? That's what's at stake here. And I do appreciate the work the staff has done, and I appreciate the opportunity to offer these comments.
Thank you, Kathleen. We have Jackie Brown with the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable.
Good afternoon. Greetings from the last basin in Colorado to go under administration here. You guys never told us how fun it was. And I thought I would probably be last, so I wasn't prepared. I apologize. So the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable heard a presentation from Brent Newman at our July 2018 roundtable meeting on both the state of affairs in the Colorado River Basin, the DCP efforts in Colorado, and as part of that, how the temporary, voluntary, and compensated demand management program as one of those planning tools will be fleshed out over the next few years. Brent, Becky, and CWCB staff have made themselves available to us since stepping up as leaders on those issues 8 months ago. Like the other basins in Colorado, the Yampa White Green water users have spent thousands of voluntary hours and thousands of WSRF dollars, hundreds of thousands, not millions, we can't say that yet, but maybe one day, preparing for some certainty in an uncertain future. I am here to tell you that we are equipped and ready to be part of the discussion on how our future may look while hoping to avoid compact curtailment. I cannot stand before you today and tell you that the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable is unified behind the Southwest and Colorado River District because we have not had a chance to review it as a body. I thank you for clarifying the demand management processes today from both Karen and Brent, and I will make sure that our Basin Roundtable is informed as to the developments. I would like to thank each of you for working on our behalf, and the Yampa White Green Basin Roundtable looks forward to being called upon to work collaboratively toward a more certain future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. We have Alden Vanderbrink, the Rio Blanco Water Conservancy. Welcome, Alden.
Thank you.
You want to state your
Alden
name?
Vandenbrink, Rio Blanco Water Conservancy District. I really been kind of touch and go on whether I wanted to make a statement or not, but I've been influenced to insert myself today because Jackie kind of said something here that the Yampa White Green is the last basin in the state, while the White River is the only river in the state not to have a call. And that's because of the present management strategy that they've been using to date that has successfully worked for them now for almost 150 years. And that's banking themselves on the return flows. And I'll tell you today, when I hear demand management, when I talk to the people within my district, the conservation districts that I speak with that is ag-based, it scares them because ag's got the bullseye on their back. And when you want to start curtailing agricultural within the White River Basin, that's our only storage. Only viable storage that we have today. Today, slightly, or this year, slightly below Rangeley, the minimum stream flow was down to 23 CFS. There was a couple of days where I walked that river myself. I didn't see a ripple in that river. Was it moving? I don't know. I didn't have a feather to tell. But I know that when I hear that there's other voluntary or mandatory conservation or other methods there without having a bank to back that up, if there's any shortcomings for over-conservation, that's a real concern to some people that don't have that minimum drought contingency that the other basins do with storage. I'm very passionate about that because I've experienced it myself, not once, but twice. And I'm responsible for a lot of water, for water for a lot of people and industry. And I see a conversation here developing that frankly concerns myself and a large number of people within the Rio Blanco County area. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alden. We have Kevin Lusk with Twin Lakes. Welcome, Kevin.
You mentioned my name is Kevin Lusk. I'm with the Twin Lakes Reservoir and Canal Company. I'm the president of that company. And for the record, I am a member of the Front Range Water Council, so I don't know why I got kicked to the back of the line. But,
Sorry, Kevin.
it's all right. Did want to thank the board for allowing us to bring forward some comments today. Twin Lakes is a trans-basin diversion. The majority of the shares are owned by large cities, including Pueblo, Colorado Springs, and Aurora. But the vast majority of shareholders are small water users. We're talking a fraction of an acre foot up to about 10 acre feet. For those small shareholders, this trans-basin diversion is their only supply of water. So in that regard, they are much more akin to the West Slope water users than they are to any East Slope water users. So I just say that to point out how important it is to my company to have some sort of protection in place for those trans-basin diversions. And in that regard, I would like to say that our company stands firmly behind the efforts of the state to put forward a drought contingency plan, as well as the drought storage that we're talking about in the crisp reservoirs. It is just simply the most responsible course of action that your board and our state could take. And so we want to just wholeheartedly support you with that. We've heard a lot of discussion today about voluntary compensated reductions versus involuntary curtailment. And I would echo what Mr. Raley said, is that those things will be reality with or without any storage in Lake Powell. However, if we have involuntary curtailment, it will be very much more valuable to us to put that water into a reservoir or an account that we can store that and manage that, rather than simply letting it run back down to Meade and not provide any benefit to our state. So we believe that it is not in the best interest of the state to tie the use of that to only voluntary compensation and compensated storage. Also, we've heard a lot today about transparency and consensus. I think there is a lot of consensus between the Front Range Water Council and the Western Slope entities, but there's not full consensus. In fact, there are points that we do not have consensus on, and therefore I do not believe it's in the best interest of the state to push forward with any agreements where there is not full transparency and consensus. That is a very recent thing. I actually have not been able to read what is in that letter. Just simply came in while I've been on the road, so I haven't had a chance to read it. So rather than take some rash action and jump to a lot of knee-jerk reactions here, let's take some time. I believe we have time to develop consensus around any rules that may be needed to implement any kind of drought response plan or the use of that storage account. I think the important thing has been talked about many times is that we need to get the ability to have the account, get the authority to build the drought response before we lose the opportunity. There will be time then to develop that consensus on what we do with it. But let's not put together a whole bunch of rules that may not be the right rules, or they may not work for us, and artificially limit ourselves before we even know what we have. So I would just strongly encourage you to pursue the course you're on and not create an artificial limitation on our ability to do the best thing for the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That's all that we had signed up. So I just want to make sure that everybody had their chance. Yeah, and if we don't have any other people that want to sign up, then we're going to continue on. So Brent, do you have something to add?
Just a staff recommendation. Staff recommends that the board consider, in consultation with the state engineer, adopting a position that sets forth the board's approach for determining how evaluation, exploration, and development of any demand management program in Colorado will proceed. The intent of this position and direction to staff will be to appropriately capture and address both current and future input regarding demand management as it evolves. Staff will be prepared. We have had public testimony, so there you go.
All right. Thank you, Brent. So I would take any comments from the board that the board may have. Don't all jump at once. Director George.
Well, I appreciate the many points and conversations, and it's helping me to figure out how I can help, for my part, to work through this pretty thorny predicament that we're in. And I'm really much more interested in the long term than the short term. So thank you for everyone, staff, and all the folks that are here. There'll be many more of these gatherings, I'm quite sure, because we are going to make these decisions together. No question in my mind about it. But we ought to do something today as a board. And we intended, I think, to hear out everybody. And so we've had a good run at that so far. And mostly what I'm feeling right now as I try to think back through all of the points that were made is that doing probably any type of decision making on the bigger picture is premature until we get to see what's in these documents that have been worked on so hard by the 7 states. So that's coming. I'm glad that it's going to be sooner than later. I think that's the key to this whole thing. It's part of what has caused some of the anguish, I think. It always bothers me when public bodies find it necessary to manage the public's affairs behind closed doors. And I understand that human nature causes that. so that it needs to be done probably sometimes before we can get agreement. I still don't like it, but it's happened anyhow. And it's important for us to be able to see it. And I mean us as this board, so we can decide what to do. And everybody else and that's affected by this. So that's coming. And I think I'm ready to concentrate on that, because that's even on the demand management question, that's a key piece. And I want to see what it says about it in this document before I can begin to think about piecing conditions in what we're supposed to be doing. So that's kind of where I am right now.
Director Wells.
Well, I guess I have a bunch of things to say. First of all, I think there are two distinct legal and policy processes underway. One is the drought contingency planning, which is an interstate negotiation that the state of Colorado, as the sovereign, is responsible for engaging in those negotiations and for managing the compact and any changes to the law of the river necessary to protect the state. So that, I think, is a different animal. I understand what Director George is saying about understanding what implications the drought contingency planning interstate process has. The other process is demand management, which is exclusively intrastate and is the purview of the CWCB and the state engineer. But as all things that get done in Colorado by the CWCB and the state engineer, there will be public processes and countless meetings and presentations, many of which have already occurred. And I think those things are quite different and have different expectations. They certainly have different timelines. And I don't think one can be contingent upon the other. Drought contingency, as I understand it, is not, in fact, contingent upon a demand management program. Tell me if I'm wrong, Karen, but if we have an account in Powell and we, Colorado, can't get our act together to have a demand management program that's voluntary, compensated, or any other kind, then we simply don't get any benefit from having the account. We won't have water in Powell, and a compact call will be nearer than it would have been if we had put water in the account.
To be abundantly clear, if Colorado doesn't get their act together to be able to approve a demand management program, nobody in the Upper Basin has a demand management program. Every single state of the Upper Division has to approve the demand management program before it can be established.
Okay. But the account will be there and we will just have wasted it.
Exactly.
Okay. So, so the drought contingency plan is not contingent on demand management. And demand management, I guess it's contingent a little bit. We can't do demand management and have it make any difference if there's nowhere to put the water. So we need to get the account. We need to get on the train that's going for legislation, and we need to do that no matter what. If we never have a demand management plan, it will be too bad for us and too bad for the Upper Basin. But I do think those things are separate. The state water plan actually notes this, and I want to thank Beth for quoting from chapter 9.1 of the state water plan. I was going to read that exact sentence that you read. There's another one that talks about the potential for management of demands to influence Lake Powell elevations. Hydrologic conditions in the face of climate change and increased demands will require Colorado water users to creatively and collaboratively
collaboratively manage the resources at hand. Intrastate efforts will be distinct from, but necessarily informed by, ongoing interstate processes and negotiations. And that's where we are. So that's what I think we need to look at the draft contingency plan documents. I think we need to approve them. I think we need to move forward. My view is that having obtained a storage account in Powell that is free of charge and not controlled by the rest of the system is a major breakthrough and will allow us to maybe do something to control our future, which we have very little control over without such an account. The other thing I want to say about demand management, I always get concerned with terms like target. I don't think victim was used, but other words, target on the back and, going to ruin West Slope Ag. The program, I heard similar things when the System Conservation Pilot Program was first introduced in 2015. And, but, it turned out to be an oversubscribed program. In those 3 years, 40 projects were proposed by Colorado water users. Only 20 could be funded, and there were more from other states. I am hopeful, and it's hard for me to understand how, if water savings is voluntary and compensated, anybody could feel victimized by that. Voluntary means that you want to do it, and compensated means that you get paid for it. I've had a couple of conversations with Director Dutton and Director Anderson about why we couldn't think outside the box with demand management. We've heard some reports coming out of the Rio Grande Basin and a little bit in the Gunnison, where farmers and ranchers are doing fallowing on their own and using cover crops to improve soil health. It works, Steve tells me, works really well. And it could be a soil health program. Many farmers can't afford to do it because if they don't plant their money-making crop, the cover crop is kind of a waste. But if you were in fact being compensated for not planting your money generating crop and you improving the soil health, we could work within our CS. We could actually make Colorado a more resilient state. Now I realize that's kind of pie in the sky kind of things, but people are doing it on the ground. And so there's no reason for us to think that demand management is a sacrifice. It doesn't have to be. It shouldn't be if we can figure out how to avoid it. And I really hope we will avoid the us versus them. The people on the east slope deserve to have landscape. They deserve to, we would like for those people not to move here. My kids can't buy a house or rent an apartment because the prices are so high. But, that's the way it is. So I think we can work through this. There are, in fact, people of good faith all over the room and all over the state. And we can do this, but we need to resist demonizing each other. It's really not, it doesn't help. And it's really unusual for how water has been handled in Colorado, and I hope we will take a deep breath. Brent, keep calming the room, and then we can get where we need to go.
Thank you, Director Wells. Director Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Brent and staff for, again, calming the waters here. I think as one of our speakers said, sometimes these things flare up and we have a way of calming them down, and thanks for being that agent in that. And I think we've all been there before, and these things do settle out. I have been very pleased to see that and to hear, to have having read the documents, to have it confirmed that I think all the parties are pretty close together, and there are perhaps nuances in terms of what we need to do in order to move forward. But generally, I think the agreements that we have, I think both sides have echoed the same kinds of principles that we've pursued over the last 12 years of working together under the 1177 process. And so I was very pleased to hear that. I think we do have time. I would like to see the document, the federal documents. I think that provides a framework that I think we do need to refer to, at least understand how we might work within that framework. And those are coming more quickly than perhaps this process can move. So I think once we have that, I think we'll have pretty much a complete set of positions and framework in which to move ahead and looking at demand management. But in short, I'm pleased at the progress today, and I hope you are as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Gallagher. Director Anderson.
I'd just like to make a few comments. This year with the snowpack we experienced certainly brought the issues with the Colorado River to the forefront. What we're looking at here, and Director Wells spoke of it, free storage in Lake Powell. What a boom. Plus being able to utilize the other crisp reservoirs of Navajo, Aspinall, and Flaming Gorge to mitigate shortfalls in the system. Hopefully, and I really hope it all goes through. You know, we're in the 11th hour of this. It requires legislative action on the part of Arizona and California, plus federal legislation. I've been holding my breath for some federal legislation that's considerably simpler than this for quite a while, and it's still in the mill, if you will. But hopefully this will all come together and we'll gain those two very valuable things of storage and some use of our stored water in the upper basin. As far as demand management, I find it hard to believe that this board would move ahead with some sort of demand management that did not include the wording voluntary and compensated. That would take us to work outside of the water plan, and that's just not going to happen. The strategic framework laid out there is, I believe, will be followed in any event. And I guess in closing, I'd certainly like to thank Brent for his efforts and Karen and the whole staff. And I'd also like to thank everybody that came and presented their feelings concerning these issues. As Rush George says, this all helps us, and I believe that. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Anderson. Director Hawkins.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking all of you for coming to testify or give public comment today. And I would like to note that there were no physical altercations, and I didn't see any whiskey involved. So I think we're doing pretty well. All joking aside, I appreciated the civility in which we all addressed each other today during the board meeting. I think that is what the agency and the CWCB board does. And I hope that that continues as we continue to have these hard conversations into the future. I now have a better understanding of the various positions on everything from the Western Slope agricultural community's hesitation to support storage in Powell, free non-equalized storage, whatever we're going to call it today. And I'm also hearing that everybody wants to be in the room for the discussions around demand management and mandatory curtailment, whether they're the same conversation or two sets of conversations. I think it's a very positive sign that we have roundtable participation in the room and by letters and hearing us today. I think it is very important that we are engaging the roundtables. I think there are other water users that will need to be engaged as these processes move forward. And I will note, since I am the Southwestern representative, that we have 2 tribes in the state, and we need to be mindful of how we are engaging those governments as well. I have some questions for Brent on the timeline of the staff recommendation. Might be Brent and Karen. I think we heard a lot today with the testimony. Are you suggesting that we would hear from you again at the November board meeting coming out of what we've heard today, or are you suggesting a different timeline?
We're suggesting whatever timeline the board is comfortable with. We can come back in November with something for you. We can wait until the DCP documents are circulated to the board, or you can send Karen and I to the bar and we can hammer one out right now.
We're going to be there regardless. I would agree with my fellow board members that it would be helpful for me to see the federal documents to put this all into context. I also think it would be helpful to get some more specific staff recommendations now that we have heard the public testimony and Attorney General recommendations.
All right. Thank you, Director Hawkins.
Thanks.
I'll just say, because a lot of this is new to me too. I mean, we've heard about it I've heard about it over the past few years, but there's a couple of things. I guess it doesn't surprise me because I heard it mentioned that the Front Range Water Council is pushing to have this drought contingency plan in place. That's not surprising. We're in a 20-year drought. Why wouldn't you plan for the future? I mean, you got to at least attempt to do something. So that shouldn't be surprising to any of us. And both of our economies, the economy of Colorado depends on this. It's not West Slope, East Slope. It's my economy in the South Platte Basin as well. We're dependent on this water. So we're all in this together. And I just want to thank you all for coming and discussing this openly and frankly, and that's the way we should discuss these things. And as far as I'm in with Director Wells a little bit, the storage, the drought contingency plan is different than the demand management, and the storage, because I'm an operator of 2 reservoirs, the storage is vital to how we use it, we can agree to figure that out. And so, but the storage part, and we're on kind of a time crunch. Like we said, there's a train moving. If we don't get on, we're going to be left out, and we lose out on the storage component. So that is absolutely vital to us. And then just, I do want to thank you all for coming out. But the last thing is to remember that as the Colorado Water Conservation Board, we always try to be transparent and open. And I think our staff does an incredible job in doing that. And in an effort to be transparent and open, we had a staff memo that was set out that reiterated what they heard from all their meetings. and it was turned around to where this was some kind of something else than that. And that's not something that should happen. Maybe this isn't a good analogy, but being a much more smaller district manager, I get this a lot where our farmers go down to the coffee shop and then I hear about something that I did that I really didn't do. And all they needed to do was call and ask, this doesn't seem right, so explain it to me. And after I explain it to them, they say, oh, okay, I understand that. And I understand where you're going. So that's why I liked what Brent and Karen came up with is, one call. So just call them. Oh, call Brent. Sorry, Karen doesn't. Because Brent is much more soothing. It's that fuzzy little hair. All right. So I just want to thank you. And as you can see, as a board, we have a lot more discussions to have about this, and we don't want to enter into anything quickly but it was good, and it was a good information to have for all of us. So I just want to thank you again for your participation here today. And Becky, did you have something?
If there are any other board members.
Any other? Okay. Director Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Yan, for confirming that you too get the coffee shop gossip. I find out all kinds of stuff that I did at work from the coffee shop. I just would be remiss in not thanking everybody as well. I know we have all thanked you, but everyone made a really long drive to get here, and that is not lost on us. And I know that I can tell that everybody else really appreciated the time that you took to get here, to prepare your comments and to deliver them to us. So thank you so much for that effort and for just being willing to come and speak with us. I also appreciate that everyone was candid and that we have lots of good information to deal with. My feeling is that, there seems to be consensus that this storage pool is a really good thing that could be a really helpful tool for Colorado, and that we want to take whatever steps we need to make sure that we capture this opportunity. But I also hear loud and clear that people want to know what kind of sideboards would be on the management of putting water in that tool. And so I would be interested from staff, not putting you on the spot, but as we're talking about our actions going forward, what does it look like to work on those two things together? Because it doesn't seem like they're exclusive, and it doesn't seem like we have to work on one and not the other. How do we, at the same time, be moving forward with the storage pool, but then engaging all the stakeholders in this room and many other stakeholders? Because I think we can recognize too that not everybody was here, and not everybody's represented by the people in this room, even though millions of Coloradans are represented by you folks. And so how do we make sure people are here and put the sideboards on this program so that people are comfortable? So thank you again.
Sure. Just in a brief response to that, I think that some of those questions are answered in the timeline that Karen laid out. Over the next couple of months, we're going to be working with the public, with the roundtables, and with you guys to get these, get the DCP a little better understood as what the different elements are, what the timeline is for those, but demand management and how the public, the roundtables, the IBCC, our other work groups can engage on that is going to be an ongoing effort over the next several months, if not years. So I would say just keep turning up at roundtable meetings, keep going to your board meetings. And if you want us to come talk about that at a board meeting or a roundtable meeting, let us know. We'll be there.
And just to put another point on that, Director Wells had asked if, what happens if Colorado couldn't get their act together. The flip side of that is if Colorado does get their act together, we still have to get an agreement with 3 other states in the Upper Basin before anything can happen. So the drought contingency plan timeline is solely to secure the ability to get storage. What we do and how we access that storage, I appreciate Brent's representation, next month or whatever. This is years long worth of discussion. These are highly technical, highly legal, highly not political, but policy-oriented questions that are going to need to be answered, not just for Colorado, but for Wyoming, New Mexico, and Utah, and how we get those all working together to be a demand management program for the Upper Basin. So in answer to your question, Director Dutton, we have the drought contingency plan securing storage possibly if we have this narrow opportunity to succeed, as Director Anderson had identified.
we too have experienced waiting when we're trying to get federal legislation passed. We have that limited opportunity. We will continue to be talking about demand management and what it could, should not look like in Colorado concurrently with that. But we have taken this, and I think a number of people in the other upper basin states have recognized having a meaningful discussion on demand management doesn't even happen unless we have storage secured. Why would we do the brain damage to figure something out if we don't even have any place to put the water? This is brain damage. I mean, this is a lot of work we're going to have to go through. And if nobody has any sense of security that they're going to get something out of it, why do it? So it's not a one-to-one process. They are concurrent, and one needs to kind of happen so the rest of it can continue to develop. But nobody has ever, I know from my staff, and I think my boss would support me, as well as the CWCB staff, nobody's anticipating that we would have the demand management program set up in any near future. Hydrology might change that a little bit, and we'll get really, really active, but those questions still need to be answered regardless.
Thank you. Director Randall.
Thank you, Chair. Great. Thank you. I'm going to echo a few of the things that have been said. Thank yous to all the parties for being here and making the trip. Thank you for your engagement and your civility. I get to sit on a handful of boards and commissions and work with the General Assembly. And if this is what passes for high drama and acrimony, if only everyone else was so civil. You know, I think the state is in a unique and independent role here that is informed by those of you with so much at stake. And so again, thank you for that. I think the goal is a voluntary, temporary, and compensated program to manage demand for compact compliance, because we know what happens if we can't get there. There's just so much at stake. I pledge to work through this fairly, inclusively, and openly. I think the whole board feels that. I too look forward to reviewing the federal documents. I think that will provide everyone a bit of ease and security just to have a better sense of what's on the table. But I think it's important that we continue to proceed in a way that doesn't foreclose options in the future, and we'll do that together with all of you and with this board. So thanks for the chance to be here.
Thank you, Director Randall. I just left one thing out, and I just want people to remember that this whole effort is to avoid involuntary curtailment. I'm involuntarily curtailed almost all summer long on my water rights, and this is what we're trying to avoid. So we need to work together, and I hope that we can, and I think we can. So, Director.
I just wanted to say one thing, and I wanted to echo all the board's comments, and also remind everyone that at the CWCB, we view the water plan as our guide as we move forward. And I would be remiss if I didn't remind everyone that coincidentally, Brent Newman, who's now the Interstate and Federal Section Chief, worked with all of our stakeholders, along with the Attorney General's office and the board, to develop then what is now quoted so many times today. And so that was a transparent process. We are intending to stay transparent. My view on leadership is the same today as it was then. And I view leadership as servanthood. And that is where we take the interests of all other parties into our decisions. And that is the way that we are operating and will continue to operate. And that is all I have to say.
All right, thank you. So we did have a staff recommendation before us. I don't know how the board members would. Director Wells.
I didn't perceive that staff recommendation as being a vote. It wasn't that kind of board item. In fact, there really wasn't a board item. It was sort of, why don't you think about, coming up with some guidelines. And so I don't think it was actually noticed as a sort of action item. So I guess I don't think we need to do anything. Is that fair? Okay, thank you.
That's a good point. Thank you, Director Wells. All right. Is there any further discussion? Okay, thank you. That closes agenda item 13. We're going to take a break because this took a little longer than, so we'll take a break and then we'll come back in 15 minutes or 10 minutes? 4 o'clock. We'll come. Agenda item, let's get back to business here. Agenda item 14, Glenwood Springs Recreational and Channel Diversion. And we have Eric with us.
Good afternoon. For the record, my name is Eric Sky with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Don't worry, you're not going to have to hear me drabble on forever. I'm just here to introduce the topic for you today. Before I hand it over to Mark Hamilton and Jonathan Kelly here, who are representing the city of Glenwood Springs, kind of wanted to give you a little bit of context. So back in July of 2015, the CWCB board had a public hearing and determined findings of fact for this particular recreational and channel diversion. I relived the whole thing so you didn't have to. So spoiler alert, I'm about to give the 3 recommendations that were approved. I was going to do a word for word reenactment, but we don't have time. So the first finding of fact that was approved was the adjudication and administration of the RICDs will materially impair the ability of Colorado to fully develop and place to consumptive beneficial use its compact entitlements. The second finding was the proposed RICDs will not affect the natural environment that in-stream flow water rights protect. And finally, the adjudication and administration of the RICDs and the amounts claimed will not promote maximum utilization of the waters of the state. So we've already had the hearing. We already have findings of fact. What are we doing here today? There's been a lot of time passed, about 3 years. We only have 3 board members who were there at the original hearing. We've had 2 different project managers. There may have been a partridge in a pear tree. I'm not sure. But I do know that the Glenwood Springs folks and all the opposition has been working very hard to come up with a settlement concept. Particularly, they've been working with the home state partners. So without further ado, I would like to bring up Mark Hamilton and Jonathan Kelly.
Welcome, Mark, Jonathan.
Thank you.
You state your name and who you're with.
Mark Hamilton. I'm with Holland Hart in our Aspen office, so I'm on this side of the hill. With me today, Jonathan Kelly from Wright Water Engineers in Glenwood Springs. We've been representing the city of Glenwood Springs in this case since about 2011, when we were initially hired by the city to pursue it. Today, just to be clear on how we came to be here, your staff invited us to come in, and as Eric just pointed out, we understand that very few of you were on the board the last time this was before the board. And so the purpose of today, as we understand it, is not for decision making, rather only for an update, and in particular, an update as to settlement progress since your board had a hearing in 2013, as Eric just described. So we thank you for the chance to bring you up to speed and look forward to moving forward with this case, we hope. First, that slide wasn't, do we have the right one? No. There's slides in here that aren't. You're just supposed to start. Okay. Fair enough. Apologize for that. I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, and I'll be back in a little bit.
Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. So as Mark said, I'm with Wright Water Engineers in Glenwood Springs, and going to provide some of the technical background for the RICID application. The original reasons that the city was interested in pursuing an RICD water right was to protect and enhance the current uses. As many of you probably know, the Glenwood Canyon is a very popular recreation area, and there's considerable boating activity already occurring there. And the city was very interested in protecting what was there and further enhancing that, especially beyond the rafting that's currently there, and perhaps getting into more of the large kind of boating festivals that occur in other stream basins at this point in time. Also, they wanted to complement the existing experiences and enhance their existing recreation-based economy. The city filed for the RICID water rights at 3 locations. This is the Colorado River. Here's the city of Glenwood Springs at the confluence with the Roaring Fork River. The most upstream site was the No Name at the CDOT rest area. The middle site was the Horseshoe Bend area location, and then the most downstream site was right above the confluence with the Roaring Fork River. We refer to that as the Two Rivers site. I want to point out that we understand, we fully recognize that the CPW has some concerns over the Horseshoe Bend site. We have worked with them and are continuing to work with them to try to resolve their concerns and bring that to fruition in the final decree. So with regard to the actual flow claims that were made in the application, there are 3 different time periods. The April 1 through June 7 is at 1,250 CFS. And that flow rate is very important because that is the same as the senior Shoshone power right. And so you'll see on both sides of the bracket here, also July 24th through September 30th, we're also at 1,250. Those flows pretty much are there today, and we're looking to just further protect them beyond what the Shoshone Power Call already does in terms of bringing those flows through this reach. And obviously being a non-consumptive right with the Shoshone and the non-consumptive right with the RISD, they're complementary in that respect. For a 46-day period from June 8th through July 23rd, we are seeking flow rates above the Shoshone existing senior power right. Those would be 2,500 CFS and 4,000 CFS, which would be limited to a 5-day festival that would center around the July 4th weekend. And that was a very important aspect for the city, and the original application was to have an event that can be focused on one weekend late in the season when all of the other smaller tributaries and other stream systems usually don't have the flow July 4th weekend to support a boating festival. We're fortunate the location that we're on, the Colorado River Basin, with a large tributary area where the flows can support a festival after all the other festivals throughout the state. One of the agreements that we made with some of the objectors was a modification from the original application from a 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. to reflect that those daylight hours actually vary throughout the season. And so we've modified our proposed language to reflect that. It's actually more detailed than sunrise and sunset, but we've basically accommodated that concern that in the shoulder seasons, the daylight hours are fewer. Again, the 4,000 CFS would be limited to just a 5 consecutive days centered around the July 4th weekend. And then these sites are all essentially identical hydrologically. So we're seeking one set of flow rates that would be consistent for all 3 locations. This basically goes through that same table in graphical form. One of the most important things we did in terms of where we were making the flow claims was focusing on trying to preserve what's called the rising limb of the hydrograph, and that's this part right here, because that's the most reliable flow. So any future water planning that's going to occur is not going to focus on the tail end when these flows are less reliable, but focus on the rising limb. Any kind of future storage project, that's where you're going to focus on trying to get that water supply. So we purposefully shifted our flows to the later part of the season, in part because that was the July 4th weekend that we were wanting to bracket, but also to preserve, because we anticipated that that's where most of the objectors would have concerns, is if we put a new call on the river during those free river conditions in the spring runoff. So we wanted to preserve that. I mentioned earlier that the vast majority of our call period is consistent with the existing Shoshone power right of 1,250 CFS. And so the only flows that we're actually claiming are a 46-day window between June 8th and July 23rd that includes the event flows. And so you see what the impact would actually be beyond what calls are already on the stream system for most years. As you all know, the statutes have a provision that certain requirements are imposed if the volume claimed by the RISD exceeds 50% of the available flow during the RISD period. This was something that at Ignacio in 2015, we had agreement with CWCB staff that we are in fact below that 50% threshold and therefore not under those constraints. But the main reason for putting this up there is we're actually significantly less than that 50% when you consider the Shoshone power call is already going to be there for the majority of our RISD season, and we're basically just providing the exact same except for that 46-day window. The second point was that well, I guess those two go together, but the 128,700 acre feet, which is the volume in that 46-day window, is also going to be subject to the call reduction provision. Yes.
We have a question, Director George.
I don't know whether it's best to interrupt you now when the question is proposed or later, so I'm just going to do it now.
Okay.
I want you to help me. What happens to what you're telling us if there is no Shoshone call?
You know, and that was certainly one of the motivations for the city's application and the reason for lack of a better term, backstopping the Shoshone power call with the RISD water rights. We obviously recognize that a 2013 priority is not going to be able to command the same flows through the canyon as a 1906 water right. But that certainly was part of our intent, was to try to backstop those Shoshone flows.
But you know, the Shoshone flows are augmented by stored water under various agreements. So all of that goes away too. If something happens, if Excel decides that Shoshone call is not going to be made or is sold or changed in some way, it's just worrying me that you're interweaving these into something that you can't control. We can't either, of course, that may not be there. And I just need to see what difference it makes.
I certainly agree that our ability to preserve those 1250 water CFS would be diminished if the Shoshone call wasn't there and those releases weren't being made. Obviously, within the constraints of the RISD application, we have limited ability to go beyond that. You know, I think that the other point I would make would be that we have designed our preliminary designs for the actual structures themselves are scaled for different flow rates. And the flow rates, I think we had a minimum flow of 500 CFS for a reasonable recreational experience. So if we're not able to maintain those 1250 flows and they do drop below that, we would still have structures that would make a reasonable recreational experience.
That helps. Thank you.
The last part is simply that the volume will be reduced because we're limited in terms of how many hours a day we can call. So it's roughly, well, basically cut in half by the amount of time that you can actually call per the statute, and then further with negotiations with objectors.
So just to quickly bring the board up to speed on who's in the case and who's not in the case at this point, this slide shows the parties who have settled, which include Denver Water, CDOT, West Divide Water Services District, BLM, the Glenwood Hot Springs Pool, and the Grand Valley entities. A few of these settlements I would spotlight for the board. The BLM settlement relates to the fact that the middle structure, the Horseshoe Bend structure, would be located at a point that's accessible across BLM. So the settlement relates to the need to permit that through the BLM. CDOT's settlement is similar. Both the Horseshoe Bend, actually all three sites are probably going to involve some level of interaction with CDOT because of their proximity to I-70. The one I would really spotlight is the easternmost one. The no-name site, it would be at a rest area that is currently owned and maintained by CDOT, and so there would need to be a comprehensive understanding dealing with everything from sharing of bathrooms and parking and all those other things. So those haven't been resolved yet, but the settlement provides a methodology for working through those issues. The Glenwood Hot Springs Pool, was most concerned about the lowest structure, the one in town, the two river structure is what we call it, because of the proximity of the pool operations and the aquifer that feeds those pool operations. So a stipulation was entered into with them that contains some construction-related protocols for opportunities to see designs and to have understandings about excavations and those sorts of things before the project goes forward at that location. And then lastly, the settlement with Denver Water, which was reached shortly after the Ignacio hearing, is a stipulation that provides for Glenwood Springs, pursuant to the CRCA, not to exercise the RICD in a way that would conflict with the exercise of Denver's future project under the CRCA. The opposers that remain today include the following. We, sitting after post Ignacio with the parties we just mentioned being out of the case, we looked at this list and considered, what are is this case going to go to trial? Is this case going to be capable of resolution by settlement? And I'm going to skip forward to the next slide. As your staff has indicated in your memo today, and I'm sure your board is familiar with, the three statutory factors for the board to provide recommendations to the water court on are set forth before you. One being injury to in-stream flows, one being compact impairment, and the third being maximum utilization. We looked at that list, and of course, injury to in-stream flows really isn't an issue here because there isn't an in-stream flow in the reach in which Glenwood Springs has claimed these structures. But the last two were the reasons for the negative recommendations that emanated at the Ignacio hearing. And to me, they really dovetail with each other and really relate to the same question. How do we reasonably balance Glenwood Springs' claims for these recreational water rights with the needs of other water users in the state to develop more water rights under the, to not impair the compact, and maximum utilization to me is ultimately that balancing. And in the past, as your board I'm sure is familiar, in the most recent few RICDs that came through, notably Pickens County, Grand County, have included what we call carve-out provisions. And these carve-out provisions have tended to be a subordination, where for a period of time following entry of an RICD decree, there's an opportunity for junior appropriators to go appropriate new water rights and to have their water rights then be the beneficiary of a subordination. So the RICD water rights fall back in line behind the new water rights. And in this case, given the Shoshone water right and given the location on the river we were on, we felt as the applicants team that using a true subordination concept wasn't the best way to achieve the goal of protecting maximum utilization. And the reasons for that were really twofold. One is that with the existing Shoshone call, we didn't think it was appropriate to subordinate that portion of the Glenwood Springs RICD claim because folks on the river are already developing augmentation plans, et cetera, to meet that call. And then the other hurdle we had was the statutes now provide that an applicant for an RICD can only have one flow rate claim per day. And so one might have 10 years ago before that statute have thought, well, you could apply for a 1250 water right and a 2500 water right on the same day, and then we could have a subordination of the 2500 as needed. But that really didn't seem to be legally permissible under the statutes to us either. And so that caused us to think what we need is a unique solution here. And what we came to and what we're here today to discuss is a call reduction concept in lieu of a true subordination concept. The idea is that the potential, I'm not sure injury is the right term to use, but the potential impact to these junior water rights would be between the 1250 and 2500 flow rate. And so what we've done is work hard at coming up with a call reduction provision to go into the decree that provides that under certain circumstances, Glenwood Springs will reduce its 2500 CFS call potential down to as far as 1250 as needed to avoid impairment of these benefited water rights, junior water rights to the RICD. Another thing we've worked hard on, and with a lot of input from Kevin Lusk, actually from Colorado Springs Utilities, who is here, is having it be sort of a real-time process. The prior RICD decrees and their carve-outs were really a document that could be read and legal subordinations applied, but they really did not directly relate to whether there was actual real-time impact. And the call reduction scenario that Jonathan's going to walk you through in a minute is we've designed it to be real-time impact, meaning that there will be volumetric limits and flow rate measurements at the points of diversion or storage, as the case may be, of the upstream junior water right, and the ability to immediately, if Glenwood Springs' call in excess of 1250 is causing injury to that, the ability to ratchet the call back as necessary on an ongoing basis using electronic data to do that. So I'm going to hand that over to Jonathan to give you the details.
So Mark already kind of touched upon, how this approach differed from some of the others, which were more true carve-outs and true subordination agreements. One other just quick big picture item is, as I get into the eligibility criteria, you'll notice that there are criteria by which the water rights that can trigger this provision are identified. So they are triggered by specific rights, but it results in a call reduction that everyone on the stream would benefit from. So it's not selective in terms of just benefiting those water rights, even though they're the ones that would trigger the provision, if that makes sense. So the eligibility criteria that we worked very hard with the objectors, in particular home state partners, to come up with were the projects and the water right holders should be direct flow or storage rights, upstream of course, and junior to the RICID application, which was filed at the end of 2013. So it'd basically be 2014 or later water rights, and water rights that are developed within 30 years of reaching final decree in this case. In order to properly allow the division engineer's office to administer this provision, we needed to have a decreed volume that each water right would be seeking to achieve. And once that volume was achieved, that water right would be deemed to be satisfied. And also real-time measurement, as Mark alluded to, and reporting of those real-time measurements to the division engineer's office. The water rights would also have to be exercised in priority. Another way to say that is if it weren't for the RICID, those water rights would be able to divert. And also not subject to an augmentation plan. Because of where we are in the stream system upstream of Shoshone, the vast majority of new water being developed, if they want a firm supply, they're going to have to get an augmentation plan. And there are augmentation sources available. And so those water rights, we felt shouldn't really get a windfall from this provision, since they were already having to develop an augmentation plan to cover the out of priority depletions associated with the Shoshone call. And then once these eligible water rights were being tabulated, they would be capped at 60,000 acre feet per year, or 30 years from the date of the decree, whichever one occurs first. So I mentioned the 60,000 as the annual cap value, but that would be for the entire RICID season. And in fact, entire year, sorry. In fact, that we only have this 46-day window when our flow claims exceed the 1250, which is kind of the floor for the call reduction provision. So during this 46-day period, when the flows are above 1250, if eligible water rights come in and demonstrate that they merit the call reduction, then if cumulatively in any given year, those reductions result in a cumulative volume of 30,000 acre feet, then the commitment for the city to continue a call reduction would cease, and we would then be able to retain, go back to our full call scenario. And the second point is that rather than having the call reduction be somewhat binary in that it's either 2500 CFS or 1250, we came up with language that would allow for the call reduction to be only sufficient enough to allow that water right to be satisfied. So in some cases, I think if we think about maybe a 5,000 acre foot reservoir that is filling during the runoff in June, and then on June 8th, they only have 4,000 of their 5,000 acre feet in storage. And so they've gone through the criteria, they're an eligible water right, and they say, hey, we'd be able to continue getting our last 1,000 acre feet of fill if it weren't for the RISD, then we would reduce that amount sufficient to whatever their ability to capture would be and allow them to continue to fill until they hit their 5,000 acre foot limit, and then we would resume call at our full rate. So that ability to reduce the call only sufficient enough to allow those water rights to achieve their yield was a key component that came through the negotiations. And kind of where we started from, kind of wanted to close, and that is for the city, two of the important things were that the call reduction would never go below 1250. And so even if there are other water rights that aren't being satisfied, we would never have to reduce our call below what the existing Shoshone call is at 1250. And then what was very important for the city was that the 5-day event flows would be exempt from the call reduction provision. So only when we're calling at the 2,500 CFS would the call reduction provision kick in. And this allows the city to plan an annual festival for that July 4th weekend without worrying about whether or not they're going to get a call reduction and not have the water sufficient for that festival.
I have a question. Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Director George.
This is a very novel concept, and I suspect the division engineer had something to say about the complexity of administration. What did you work out?
You know, I don't want to speak on behalf of Alan Martellero, but I did recently, last week, have a conversation with Alan where we walked through the provision. And quite frankly, I think he felt it was perhaps more than was necessary in terms of the complexity, but he understood that that's where we had to get to with the objectors in terms of a settlement. And the bottom line was he did believe that he could administer this provision.
I'm sure he's looking for more work.
Oh, Director Ryan.
I'm just going to use that, if I could, as an opportunity to follow up on that. And Jonathan, as you were talking about that call reduction, what I was inferring is that the understanding through that call reduction in the decree would really be premised on the city and those users that are identified, or that category that's identified, would work through themselves to understand what call reduction is necessary, and that it wouldn't be the division engineer that would be tasked with comparing those upstream uses and the call, or I guess the call of the RICD. Is that right?
Yes, I think there was some shared responsibilities that were envisioned through this process. I think there was, it was envisioned that the applicant of a water right that wanted to be eligible for this had a certain obligation to meet the criteria, and then to I tell the city that we would like to be an eligible water right. And so the city would then work with those applicants to compile that list and provide that list to the division engineer's office. I think that the real-time administration would come in in terms of, and maybe this is something that Kevin, you want to help with in terms of how you envision as you might be an eligible water right holder, how you would envision that contact occurring with the division engineer's office, if you don't mind me.
I'd be glad to answer that question.
If you'd state your name, Kevin.
This is Kevin Lusk, and now I'm wearing my Colorado Springs Utilities and Homestake hat. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you again. The question was exactly how this might be administered. And the way we have envisioned it and the way we have discussed it with Glenwood is that each water right that might be subject to benefit from this call reduction agreement would have to have in place electronic measurement devices that's tied to the state's telemetry system. So that data would be available real time on what they are diverting or what inflows and outflows would be, so that there would be readily available to both Glenwood and to the division engineer's office the amount of water that may be needed to satisfy that call. And then it's a fairly routine spreadsheet operation to figure out what the reduction in the call would be to be able to continue those particular rights to continue to divert. So I would envision it being a kind of every morning you come into the office, you look at what the flows are, you look at how much might be needed to satisfy that, and then you just put the call reduction in place on what that would be. So it's not dissimilar to how water rights are operated in other divisions on more or less a real-time basis. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much. Yes, that does.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
So before we get into any more Q&A, I did want to invite up Jay Skinner from Colorado Parks and Wildlife to briefly, Jay, talk about CPW's outstanding concerns with the RISD.
Welcome, Jay.
Good afternoon. Or is it evening yet? For the record, Jay Skinner with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Some of you might remember that CPW filed for party status and provided testimony at the 2015 hearing on the Glenwood Springs RICD. The hearing officer at that time gave me 2 minutes, probably the fastest I've ever had to talk in my life. But I'll try to do almost that good, because I know that we're way behind schedule today. So some of the issues outlined in our pre-hearing statement then are still sort of true today. In anticipation of this agenda item today, Katie Birch and I reached out to our Glenwood Springs office to see if any activity has occurred between CPW local staff and Glenwood Springs on this project. And, there's really been no contact between the city and the representatives and consultants. But we were also aware that there was a fair amount of work going on the RICD decree with the other objectors. So since many of you were not on the board at the time of the 2015 hearing in Ignacio, I thought I would quickly sort of summarize some of CPW's concerns at the time and how we see that some of those have been addressed or resolved at this point in time. There was a number of issues related to permitting and design and construction activities of the Whitewater Park. At the time, we urged Glenwood Springs to engage with CPW early in pre-404 permit consultations. The proposed decree for this water right does have a term in there that addresses that specifically, that those conversations will happen in advance. So I think that from CPW's standpoint, that those permitting and construction issues are largely addressed at this point in time. We also raised some question about this event flow issue. I think that we really didn't have any issue with the flows being claimed in the application at the time, since it sort of follows the normal pattern of hydrology. But as it relates to event flows, it seemed to us that maybe as a contingency planning strategy, the city, when trying to plan one of these events, they may have to secure some water and storage to make sure if we had a year like this year and you have people from all over the world showing up for your event, that there may have to be some sort of release of purchased reservoir water upstream or something like that. And sometimes the timing of those things can cause fishery life cycle concerns with spawning and emergence and fry in the river and those sorts of things. We were worried about the source of water for these events being, way upstream and possibly have impacts up the Eagle or up the Blue or on up the Colorado. And we once again urged consultation with CPW when working through those sorts of contingency planning for the event flows. I think that in talking to Mark in the hallway, I think that we can expand that existing term in the decree to cover those event flow issues as well as the permitting issue. So the biggest issue that sort of remains at this point in time was the siting issues for the Whitewater Park. And some of you may remember, or probably many of you don't, that we stated our support for the Two Rivers site. It's an existing site. There's already a fair amount of human activity there. There's an existing boat ramp there. And we thought that it probably had the least amount of human or construction related impact. There was a lot of infrastructure there as well. I would say that the No Name site falls in a second place position as far as we're concerned. And as was stated before, our feeling about the Horseshoe Bend site is pretty problematic from a fish and wildlife perspective. I can go into the reasons for that, or I can let you ask me a follow-up question if you want to at this point in time. But we totally understand the need for having a couple of alternatives in your hip pocket as you're working through a proposal like this. We wouldn't be upset if the Horseshoe Bend site was taken out of the application at this point in time, because there are a number of issues there. I guess finally, whitewater parks in general, our experience has been they tend to grow in size. The engineering for this, for these 3 sites under consideration here, talk about 2 structures per site. At the hearing, we talked about trying to hold that to 2 structures per site. I think that with the water court decree term that we have, if a site was selected and there was some sort of expansion at that site, that term of pre-consultation and working through issues prior to a new 404 permit for that expanded site, I think could address a lot of those construction and permitting issues. And just as a sidelight, I think that CPW kind of remains skeptical of aquatic benefits of whitewater parks in general. We have a fair amount of recent research collected by CPW that shows that whitewater structures, while they look like they create a really nice pool downstream, any claim that is good for fish is really unfounded. Those pools look like pools, but they don't behave like pools hydraulically. and fish behavior and sampling have shown us that the fish don't really use them like they use real natural pools. So that's some of the information that has come to light since the 2015 hearing. I thought I would prime your appetite on those for future RICDs. And I think that pretty much sums up everything. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
All right. Thanks, Jay.
Not 2 minutes, but I did my best.
Director Chartrand.
Jay, you said there was a problem with one of the sites, but you didn't share with us what your concerns were. Could you do that, please?
Yeah, and at the original hearing, I think I did a fairly complete job of this. But the no-name or the Horseshoe Bend site is problematic from a fish and wildlife point of view, and it really amounts to the fact that that is one place on the river where the river sort of departs from the highway corridor and goes out and around the twin tunnels there right as you're going into to Glenwood Springs, and it offers some isolation or refuge, if you will, for fish and wildlife resources. It's away from the highway, it's away from the railroad, and we have peregrine falcons that frequent that area, a fairly decent size bighorn sheep herd that likes that solitude that exists there, and the river in that area provides good aquatic refuge habitat, lower velocity, deeper pools where fish tend to congregate as well. And we also think that site would require a fair amount of construction activities because it's basically inaccessible to the public at this point. So, all those things rolled together had that site, at least from the local office perspective, as being, less appetizing from our standpoint for an activity like this.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jay? Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
So with that, I'd just real quick like to recognize the hard work that the city of Glenwood Springs has put into this settlement concept. And I'd also like to note that all of the language suggestions that we included in those 2015 findings of fact were put into the new decree. So with that, I would open it up to any other Q&A that you may have for myself, Mr. Hamilton, Mr. Kelly here. We also have Brent Newman and Jen Mealy in the audience, and we have a couple homestake representatives back there.
All right. Any questions? Director Chartrand.
Use the term final decree. Have you defined what that means? Have you thought about what that means and what might happen if someone wants to change their existing water right?
The question, if I could clarify, it relates to the term final decree as far as the eligible water rights in the call reduction provision. We have talked about that. And we've even acknowledged that, some folks might go in and get a decree that does not comply initially and then later decide they want to be eligible. And so in our discussions with Homestake, we have talked about changes, and there's nothing that we're putting in this decree that would prevent anyone from seeking a water court change for purposes of becoming eligible. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I have a couple more. Can I, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman? Thank you. Since you first proposed the RICIDs, has the quantity of water that you're seeking changed from your application in 2013?
The flow rates have not changed. The volume, however, continues to drop as we do things like reduce the hours of operation, add call reduction mechanisms on top of that. So I would say, yes, it is less of a claim than it was, but not because of the flow rates.
And my last question, what kind of obstacles exist or that you anticipate with what you need from BLM from a permit perspective as well as CDOT?
From the BLM and I have not studied this recently, I apologize, but to the best of my recollection, the BLM permitting issue only relates to the fact that the old Highway 6 corridor that runs from No Name westerly along the river into Horseshoe Bend crosses BLM ground. The city of Glenwood Springs owns a park property that's in that piece of Horseshoe Bend where the structures would actually be, but to get there, you're driving through BLM ground. And so there would be presumptively a special use permit needed. And the stipulation we worked out with the solicitor's office provided for that process to occur before development of that site. With regard to CDOT, Jen Mealy actually was the Attorney General for CDOT in a former life, and she helped me work on that. I don't know if you hear Jen? There she is. To my recollection, it again is similar in terms of setting forth a process for Glenwood Springs and CDOT to go through once Glenwood Springs decides on which site to move forward on. There would then be a consultation with CDOT and a joint process to determine how to address the impacts, not unlike the BLM, but of course it would deal with any easements that were needed across state highway property or, like I said, shared bathrooms, parking. I think they talked about I-70 emergencies when they need to use the parking because the highway is shut down, and how do we do that with events? We went through all sorts of things, but basically there's a stipulation that lays out a process for the state and Glenwood to work out once we determine what site. But each of the three sites have differing impacts from CDOT, so it didn't make sense to figure that all out right now.
All right, thanks. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric, as well. So we'll move on to agenda item 15, Attorney General's report. Director Chartrand.
Mr. Chairman, Directors, the AG's report is in the board materials, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that you may have.
Are there any questions for Director Chartrand?
If there are no questions pursuant to statute, I recommend that the board make a motion to go into executive session. I'd suggest a small break so that we can switch tapes. To consider items 16A, B, and D through G as identified on the board's agenda. This session is authorized pursuant to the provisions of Section 24-6-4023A2 of the Colorado Revised Statutes.
I move we go into executive session.
It's been moved by Director Anderson, second by Director Dutton, that we go into executive session. Is there any discussion? Seeing,
I'm sorry,
you got a discussion.
Would you repeat for me which items are included in the executive session to the exclusion of everything else in the agenda?
Items 16A, B, D, E, F, and G.
Thank you.
All right. Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, we shall proceed to vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So we'll take a, how long of a break? Do you want to?
We have in the great foresight of staff and our Attorney General's office, we knew that we would run over, so we have some food outside. So get a plate, take some break, and get back in, and we'll come do executive session.
How long?
15
minutes. Quickly get your
You can
food.
eat during executive session.
Okay. Just don't talk with your mouth full. Okay.